Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The day had started like any other. The early morning hours slipped quietly by amid hallways crowded with students, laughter, and scattered voices that blurred with the echo of the doors closing after each class. The university campus, so familiar, stood as a constant in my daily life. However, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that gripped me, a subtle bewilderment that hovered in the air, as if time was slipping by at a different speed depending on what I was doing at any given moment. When classes became monotonous and the teacher's words seemed to be diluted in a sea of indifference, the clock would tick with overwhelming speed. Only when the mind was scattered in empty thoughts did time seem to stretch endlessly, as if it wanted to trap me in its spiral. The course of the day went on without major alterations. My college day ended, as usual, with a less than memorable hustle and bustle. The faces of my classmates blurred in the crowd as I hurried out of the university to get home. Today, more than ever, I wanted to escape the crowds and the hustle and bustle. There was something in the air that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the storm that was beginning to form on the horizon, or maybe it was my own mind, tired of the routine, making me feel as if the world around me was taking a strange, out-of-control turn. My name is Jesus Alberto. I am a second-year finance student. I live in a modest apartment in a multi-story building. My life, despite the complications of college, was fairly routine. That afternoon, however, something would change without my anticipating it. As I left the campus, the rain began to fall furiously. It was no ordinary storm. The darkness of the sky expanded rapidly and the wind pushed the rain against my face, drenching me immediately. I ran quickly, wanting to reach the safety of my home before the storm worsened. In the distance, the building where I lived loomed as a safe haven, a place where the storm could not reach me. But what I didn't know at that moment was that, upon reaching my home, what I thought was a refuge would be transformed into a prison of uncertainty. I climbed the stairs quickly, water soaking my clothes. I hurried to the elevator, seeking the comfort of a quick trip to my apartment. The sound of my boots hitting the wet floor was a reminder that not only was the rain pounding hard, but also the time that seemed to slip through my fingers. The elevator, ever so efficient, began its ascent with its usual familiarity. But just then, the light flickered. It was a brief flicker, like a sigh from the building, but something inside me changed. I didn't understand what was happening. I just felt a slight discomfort in my stomach, a kind of premonition that the day was about to take an unexpected turn. The elevator stopped suddenly. A thud cut through the sound of the storm hitting the roof of the building, and the light went out completely. Darkness enveloped the metal cubicle I was in. The first thing I did was reach for my cell phone, but the screen showed only the network provider's logo, with no signal. I couldn't reach anyone. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a temporary power outage. But something in the atmosphere told me that things were not that simple. The feeling of being completely isolated, surrounded by gloom and the rumbling of thunder, began to take hold of me. Every creak of the elevator, every crackle of the rain felt amplified. But what completely chilled me was the feeling that I was not alone. In the darkness, something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. My breathing quickened, and an inexplicable chill ran through my body. I tried to press the emergency button, but nothing happened. Time passed, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. However, my mind was trapped in a cycle of irrational thoughts. Doubt settled in my mind. Who else was in the building? Who could be there in the middle of that storm? My ears picked up a muffled sound, a thud coming from the first floor. I remained silent, trying to listen. The rain was still falling. The thunder was rumbling, but that thump continued. Closer and closer. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking through the building. Fear settled in my chest. Was it a real person? Or was it something my mind, influenced by the darkness and tension, had created? The sound, steady and rhythmic, grew closer and closer, and my anxiety grew. What was going on? Was there someone in the building who shouldn't be there? I froze, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Suddenly, the elevator started moving again. The mechanical noise snapped me out of the trance I was in. The light flickered, barely illuminating the space I was in. In that brief flash, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure, standing in the corner of the elevator, motionless, like a shadow that shouldn't be there. For an instant, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I was sure there was no one else in the elevator when I entered, but there was that figure, watching me in complete silence. Terror engulfed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My body tensed and a wave of panic swept through every corner of my being. The man remained motionless, as if he was waiting for something, as if his presence was the only thing that mattered at that instant. My thoughts were scattered. Who was he? How had he gotten there? I hadn't heard any noise to indicate his presence. Had he entered while I was out, while I was on my way to the elevator? Uncertainty gripped me. The man was not moving, but his presence was becoming more unbearable with each passing second. My mind was beginning to lose control. Finally, the figure began to move. It was not a normal movement. It was not the calm walk of a person. It was as if someone was crawling, approaching me in a way that defied logic. I tried to press the elevator buttons, but nothing happened. I couldn't get out. I couldn't escape. The figure advanced slowly, and each step seemed to resonate in my mind, like a drum that accelerated the rhythm of my fear. My eyes could not detach from it. The flickering light barely illuminated the man's face, but in the gloom, his expression became more unsettling. There was no emotion, just an eerie calm. When the elevator finally reached the floor of my apartment, the door opened automatically, but the man did not disappear. He stood there, watching me, as I ran to my door with my heart racing, my mind completely out of control. The pounding of the storm finally ceased, but the fear persisted. Despite being in the safety of my home, something had changed. Something had broken that night. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the elevator, about the figure I had seen, about the feeling of being trapped. What happened that night didn't make sense. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind, disturbed by fear, played a trick on me. What I did know, however, was that something had changed inside me. The storm had ceased, but the fear did not go away. Doubt and paranoia were with me. The feeling that I was not completely safe, that something dark was lurking, would not leave me. What I learned that night was that fear doesn't always come from what we can see. Sometimes the real terror lies in what we don't understand, in what we can't control. The human mind is a dangerous terrain when fear takes over. And in the midst of the storm, I learned that the worst is not always what we fear, but what we think is lurking, waiting to catch us. Sometimes the only way to free ourselves is to recognize that not everything we fear is real, but that fear is. I've been trying for years to forget what happened that night. Some people think that the mind forgets, that time erases the deepest traces, but I know better. The rain, the darkness, the noises, the feeling of being trapped, everything is still fresh in my memory. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, the echo of the storm rumbling in my ears, and for a moment, I feel like I'm still there, in the woods, lost. I can't shake that feeling, that tension. It was several years ago, maybe too many to keep thinking about what happened, but the memory lingers. It all started when, in an attempt to escape the city and take a break, I decided to venture alone into a small forest I had heard mentioned in a talk I overheard in a coffee shop. Not that I had any particular interest in solitary nature walks, but at the time it seemed like a good idea. I wanted to be alone, to forget about people, about rushing, about obligations. The first day was quiet. I left early, following the trails marked on the map, enjoying the stillness, the silence, the clean air that felt different from the pollution of the city. In the afternoon, I decided to go a little further in. moving away from the main road. I wanted to explore, to feel more in touch with nature. The vegetation was thick, but that didn't stop me. However, it wasn't the easiest place to find your way around. I got lost without realizing it. At first, I didn't worry too much. I thought I just had to go back the same way, that I would soon find the trail again. But I soon realized that I didn't quite remember where I had come from. The rain began to fall, first softly, then harder. The sky clouded quickly, and the shadows of the forest lengthened. In the distance, thunder rumbled, and the storm intensified into an uncontrollable gale. Every step I took seemed heavier, the mud stuck to my boots, and my compass no longer seemed to work. Visibility was zero. I was completely disoriented. I remember how the cold chilled my bones. The rain did not stop falling, and the sound of the water crashing against the trees became deafening. The drops crashing against my face blinded me, and with every step, the wind pushed me to one side, as if trying to push me away from any clue that could give me the right direction. The landscape, which once looked like a tranquil paradise, was now an impenetrable jungle, full of shadows and distorted sounds. My breathing quickened. I had no idea where I was. Panic was taking hold of me as time passed. I had lost track of the hours, and all I could do was walk, hoping to find some shelter or at least something familiar. My mind was overwhelmed. The storm raged furiously. Every time I thought the situation couldn't get any worse, it did. That's when I saw the cabin. At first, I thought it was an illusion. Amidst the darkness and rain, it seemed like a fleeting vision, something my tired mind had made up. But as I got closer, I could clearly make out the lines of the structure. It was a small wooden hut, abandoned by the look of it, but it seemed to offer me the salvation I had so longed for, and I did not hesitate. I didn't hesitate. I headed towards it as fast as I could, feeling that every second I spent in the forest brought me closer to despair. When I reached the door, my trembling hand touched the rotting wood, and I pushed the door, which, with a creak, gave way. I quickly stepped inside and closed it behind me. The inside of the cabin was completely silent, except for the sound of rain pattering on the roof. There was no light, but a small window allowed the light from the storm to enter the room, illuminating the broken furniture, cobwebs, and accumulated dust. I sat on the floor, exhausted, breathing hard. I knew I was safe for the moment, but I also knew I couldn't stay there forever. I needed to find a way out of that place. However, exhaustion was consuming me. The rush of anxiety and fear, brought on by hours of walking in the storm, was beginning to cloud my judgment. I closed my eyes for a moment just to catch my breath. Everything was so strange, so out of place. And at that precise moment, I heard something. A noise. Something outside. It wasn't the sound of rain or trees moving. It was a different noise. A rustling sound, as if someone was walking through the woods. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be there. No one could be there. The sound continued, getting closer. Each footstep heard outside took my breath away. I thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, or some other wild being. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't that. Intuition told me there was something else, something that shouldn't be there, something that didn't want me to be there. Suddenly, I saw a figure behind the window. It was fuzzy at first, dark, just an outline. A man, a large man, standing in front of the cabin, motionless. Terror gripped me. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but he was there, watching me. At that moment, everything inside me told me that I must escape, but I didn't know how. Where would I go? The forest was beyond the storm, and the figure outside the cabin was getting closer and closer. My mind began to search for answers, to fill with questions. How had I gotten there? Why had I come? Who was it? But I had no time for such questions. The sound of rain and wind became a backdrop in my mind, and all I could hear was my breathing and the pounding of my heart, loud, anxious. A knocking on the door. It was the sound of something heavy, knocking on the wood. My body tensed. The figure was still outside. The wind was blowing stronger and the door of the cabin was shaking. I didn't move. I didn't want to make a noise. I didn't want him to know I was there. I stood still, waiting for the inevitable, but all I heard was more banging, followed by a long silence. The silence was more terrifying than any noise. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The thunder stopped, the rain subsided, and the figure disappeared as if it had never been there. The wind dissipated, and for a moment, the cabin was just a shelter in the storm. No presence at all. No trace of what had happened. When dawn finally broke, I left the cabin. I never saw that man again, nor did I find any sign that he had been there. Had it been real? Or just my exhausted mind playing tricks? The storm had ceased, but the fear stayed with me, like a vestige of what happened that night. I never understood who that man was or what he wanted from me. But what I learned is that the real terror is not always what is in front of us, but what our minds create when we are on the brink of despair. Sometimes, the greatest danger is the one we ourselves provoke with our own doubts, our own fears. In that cabin, surrounded by the storm and my own thoughts, I understood that there are places where not only shadows can lurk. And perhaps, worst of all, we will never know if the real threat is human or the darkness within ourselves. Sometimes the questions go unanswered, and the fear, it always comes back. What I experienced that night was not just a matter of being lost in the woods, nor of the relentless storm that surrounded me. It was a direct confrontation with what we are when we face the most absolute solitude. In the wilderness, far from civilization, one is stripped of the distractions and protections that give us everyday security. And it is there, in that shelterless space, that the deepest shadows within us become real. The fear I felt was not simply the fear of the man in the dark, but the fear of the unknown, of what our mind can generate when it has no answers. That figure outside the cabin could have been real, but it could also have been a creation of my own panic, a manifestation of my darkest thoughts. In extreme situations, the boundaries between reality and paranoia blur. External fears mix with internal ones, and anxiety becomes the most dangerous enemy. What I learned is that sometimes the worst monster is not outside, but inside us. And when we are lost in the dark, that monster becomes something almost tangible, something we can't see but feel deep inside. So perhaps the biggest challenge is not finding our way back home, but learning to face the shadows within. Because in the end, those shadows are what make us most vulnerable, what make us lose our way. And perhaps, what we need most is not to escape from them, but to understand that however terrifying they may be, they will never stop accompanying us. I am Juan. What I am about to tell you happened 5 years ago, on a night that, despite seeming so distant, is still so vivid in my memory. I don't know why, but that experience continues to haunt me. Maybe it's because I've always had a strange fascination for those moments when our lives take an unexpected turn, those instants that seem like coincidences, but that in the end, reveal themselves to be the turning points that define us. If I think about it with the distance that time gives, perhaps that night was when routine and fear met in my life in an irrevocable way. It was an ordinary night, at least in appearance. The clock struck about 2 o'clock in the morning, a time when the outside world seems to stop. The building where I worked was completely empty, except for me and perhaps the occasional shadow, although that was something I could only imagine. I had always preferred to work in those lonely hours, when the city seemed to have retreated into its own thoughts, leaving the streets deserted and the rain, a distant but constant sound, beating against the windows. My office was on the top floor of a skyscraper that stood on the outskirts of the city. From there, I could see the dark skyline, barely illuminated by the lights of nearby buildings, as the wind lashed against the windows, causing the walls to shake from time to time. The storm that night was particularly fierce. The gusts of wind seemed to want to rip the glass out of the windows, and the raindrops hit with such intensity that they even slipped through small cracks. But it didn't bother me. In fact, I found the solitude and the monotonous sound of the storm comforting. Without the distractions of the day, I could concentrate fully on my work, optimizing the internet connections and systems of several commercial buildings in the city. My office was filled with screens, cables, and the incessant whirring of computer fans, a constant and familiar noise that, in its own way, helped me find calm amidst the chaos of the storm outside. My mind was completely absorbed by the numbers, connections, and data paths when something changed. It was a thud, a thump. At first I thought it was an illusion caused by the storm. I knew that sometimes the wind can play tricks with the ears, distorting sounds and creating the sensation that something had fallen or hit. But this time, it wasn't like that. This sound didn't have the fuzzy character of the storm. It was something tangible, more real. Something coming from the hallway. Immediately I stopped typing, my heart began to pound, and anxiety took over. The building was empty. Who could be here at this hour? The thought that someone had come in without me noticing caused a knot in my stomach. My office door was closed, and even though the wind was still blowing hard, the feeling that something was out of place was unmistakable to me. Something was not right. However, I heard nothing else. There were no footsteps, no noises. Everything was silent again, until suddenly the office door opened with a metallic creak that chilled my blood. Through the reflection of the window glass, I saw the silhouette of a man standing on the threshold, his figure barely visible, distorted by the raindrops falling heavily. The first thing that struck me was his eyes. Empty, haunting. There was no expression on his face, not a single sign that he was there for any common reason. He wasn't a thief. He didn't seem to be interested in my belongings, or the expensive equipment on the table. His presence was, for some reason, much more disturbing. It was as if his purpose was beyond what I could understand at the time. The door closed softly behind him, and in an instant the office was filled with an oppressive calm. Silence had taken over the space. The sound of the storm, which had been so dominant until that moment, seemed to have faded away, as if it were somehow captive inside the office as well. I remained motionless. My breathing quickened, but I could not utter a sound. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? Should I call the police? There was no point. I was all alone, and any attempt to move could make things worse. The man hadn't said anything, hadn't done anything. He had simply stood there, staring at me. The fear I felt was not that of a direct threat, but of a presence that was out of place, something that shouldn't be there and yet was, something beyond my control. In that instant, the office, the screens, the wires, everything vanished. Everyday life disappeared, and I was caught in a suspended space between reality and uncertainty. I didn't understand what was happening or what the man wanted, but something in his eyes told me that this was no accident. He was there for a reason, even if I didn't understand it. Time stopped making sense. I didn't know how long it had been since the man entered. An hour? 2? More? The air was thick, the pressure in my chest was unbearable, and my mind was trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions. The only thing that seemed to exist was that silent presence, the rain pounding on the windows, and the racing beat of my heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man turned around. He didn't say a word. He made no gesture. He simply walked to the door, opened it, and closed it behind him as smoothly as he had entered. And I stood there, alone, staring at the empty space. My body tense, my mind confused, fear haunting me in every corner of the office. I didn't know if I should be relieved that he was gone, or if something even worse was about to happen. Years later, I still don't understand what happened that night. No one knew anything about the man, not the authorities, not the building's security guards. He simply disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there. But the strangest thing is that despite the fear I felt, the pressure that invaded me at every moment, I never thought of running away. The idea of running away never occurred to me. Something inside me, back then, knew that if I had reached that point, there was no turning back. The feeling of being trapped was deeper than any other kind of fear. In life, threats don't always present themselves the way we expect them to. They are not loud noises or bright lights. Sometimes the greatest danger lies in the stillness, in the silence. In those moments when we feel vulnerable and exposed, when there is nothing but uncertainty. It is in that absence of control, of understanding, that true human vulnerability lies. Fear is not always a visible enemy. Sometimes the greatest enemy is our inability to understand what is happening and the helplessness we feel when we can do nothing about it. That night, the storm was a mirror of what was going on inside me. The rain and wind represented what I could not control, what was beyond my reach. And in the end, it wasn't about escaping, or fighting, or finding a logical answer. It was about learning to live with what we don't understand, about accepting that sometimes life is like that storm that lashes out at everything, without warning, for no apparent reason. And in those moments, the only thing we can do is wait and move on. Because even though we don't always understand why, we are still alive. It was one of those nights when the rain seemed to want to swallow the world. The drops hit the asphalt hard, and the wind carried them away, turning the air into a cold and wet torrent that pierced to the bone. I was in a foreign country, far from home, where I had come looking for a respite, an escape from my daily routine, from the monotony that was suffocating me. I had decided to take a vacation with a couple of friends, and together we had planned to join the festivities of the local carnival, a vibrant event that promised fun, music, and dancing until dawn. At first, everything seemed to go as expected. The bustle of people, the colorful costumes, the echoes of music echoing through the wet streets. Every corner of the town was adorned with bright lights and glittering decorations that seemed to reflect the joy of all those participating in the festivities. We had lost ourselves in the crowd, laughing and enjoying ourselves, feeling that the weight of responsibilities had been left behind, somewhere far away. But something changed when night fell. The atmosphere, charged with a strange energy, became denser. There was something in the air, something I could not identify, but which made me increasingly uncomfortable. Among the crowd of people, the masks and colorful costumes, I began to notice a presence that made me uneasy. It was not the typical look of someone lost in the fun, but a penetrating, fixed gaze that seemed to observe beyond the superficial. Something in those eyes was not normal. They did not sparkle with the joy of a party, but with an unsettling, almost predatory gleam. The feeling that something was wrong began to creep into my bones, but I didn't know how to shape it until it was too late. At first, it all came down to a simple push and shove, a collision between bodies on the dance floor, as so often happened at crowded parties. However, something was not right. I could feel the hands of strangers clinging to me, not with the intention of pushing me, but with the determination to hold me back, to keep me there, in the middle of that human tide. I looked around trying to find my friends, but it was too late. The crowd had become chaotic, and the laughter that could be heard around me was no longer laughter of joy, but distorted laughter, of mockery or despair. I could not tell. The place, which had once seemed to be a hotbed of euphoria, began to crumble before my eyes. People moved erratically, as if something had possessed them, as if an external force was pushing them to violence. Shouts, banging, and the sound of breaking glass echoed in the distance. The music was no longer the center of the party, just a distant noise that was drowned out by the chaos that was unleashed. In a matter of seconds, what should have been a celebration turned into a nightmare of raging bodies, people running and screaming in every direction. I was separated from my friends in confusion. By the time I realized it, I was alone, lost in the crowd of strangers, unsure of who they were and what they were looking for. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if every eye in the party was fixed on me, evaluating me, waiting for something. It was a strange, oppressive feeling, as if the whole environment had changed without me being able to understand it. I tried to move quickly, but every time I thought I had managed to lose myself in the crowd, I felt a nudge, an unsettling brush, and the footsteps behind me quickened. At first, there were only a few of them, but soon their number increased and the sound of their footsteps became closer and closer. I felt panic begin to take hold of me. I ran without knowing where, with the rain hitting my face like a threat. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let them catch me. After a few minutes of running, I saw what appeared to be a shelter, an abandoned building at the edge of the street. Without thinking about it, I went inside, closing the door behind me in desperation. The building was dark, and the feeling of being safe was short-lived. I stood still, trying to control my breathing, but the fear was so palpable that my body trembled. I didn't know how many men were chasing me, but the speed with which they were approaching told me they were not few. The darkness was almost absolute, and the only respite was the sound of the rain, which now seemed to accompany me in my despair, hammering on the roof with fury. Inside the building, the silence was overwhelming. Every little noise seemed to amplify in my mind, like a constant reminder that I was not alone. My eyes were getting used to the gloom, but I kept noticing shadows moving at the edge of my field of vision, as if something was lurking. Each breath became heavier, and anxiety began to consume my mind. I knew I couldn't stay still for long. The door would not protect me forever. If I stayed there, trapped, it was only a matter of time before they found me. In the distance, I heard the rustle of footsteps. Although I couldn't see them, their presence was unmistakable. Their voices, cracked and whispered, could be heard in the distance, but the tone was clear. They were looking for me. I felt like a target. My whole body tensed and a wave of terror swept over me. I remembered the incident at the party, the strange drink I had mindlessly downed. At first I hadn't questioned it, but now it all made sense. Something had been slipped into my drink, something that wasn't just alcohol. The poison in my body, the strange feeling that invaded my mind, and worst of all, the chase. Something dark and evil was at play, and I was the prey. The sound of his footsteps was approaching. My heart was pounding, my mind clouded with thoughts of the worst. What did they want from me? Why were they chasing me? Desperation was consuming me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't let fear stop me completely. In an instant, a creaking sound beneath my feet chilled my blood. The door began to open slowly. The shadow of a man appeared on the threshold. I couldn't see his eyes, but his presence was as palpable as a weight on my chest. I felt the air rush out of me. I stood up and, with an impulse I don't know where I got it from, I ran. I ran through the building in desperation, my footsteps echoing on the cold, wet floor. Shadows stalked me, and the sound of their footsteps chased me relentlessly. Fear gave me wings, but it also overwhelmed me. I didn't know if I was running toward freedom or into an even worse trap. All I knew was that I had to keep running, that I couldn't stop. The exit door was close by. I saw it at the end of the corridor, and with all my strength I ran towards it. As I ran through it, the rain hit me furiously, but it didn't matter. I was already out of that place. The last thing I remember was the braking of a car and a hand lifting me off the ground. It was a police car, and apparently someone had seen me. The men who were chasing me were gone. There was nothing to fear anymore, or at least not for that night. Today, looking back, I still don't understand what really happened that night. I don't know what they wanted from me, or why that persecution was unleashed. Maybe they just wanted revenge for something as insignificant as a mistake, or maybe they were after something much darker, something I never understood. But what I do know, what haunts me even on my quieter days, is the question: how many of us are aware that, at any moment, we can be victims of something far more human than we imagine? The worst fear does not always come from the unknown. Sometimes, it's just the result of a bad decision, a misstep, a choice that takes us to a place where we can no longer turn back. What I learned that night, in the pouring rain and the unstoppable chase, is that real danger is never as far away as we think. Sometimes, the greatest threat is at our fingertips, and the only shield we have is our ability to doubt, to question the decisions we make. Fear, that visceral fear we feel when faced with the unknown, teaches us that, even in the fiercest storm, the real enemy is not always outside. Sometimes, it is much closer, within ourselves. The rain was coming down hard that night, pounding the asphalt with relentless fury. The constant pattering of the water enveloped me, creating an atmosphere so dense that I felt as if the whole world had surrendered to the storm. Every step on the wet ground was accompanied by an unsettling crunch, as if the city itself was being sucked under by the water. It wasn't something that bothered me. In fact, I was already used to walking in the rain. However, that night, there was something different in the air, something I couldn't decipher, something that didn't fit. I was returning home after a long shift at the restaurant, my cook's uniform still stained with grease and spices, my hands impregnated with that characteristic smell of cooking that accompanied me like a shadow. I was in no hurry, as always. My steps were slow and my thoughts were scattered between the tasks of the day and the accumulated fatigue. But there was an uneasiness in my chest, a strange feeling that I could not ignore. For the past few days, I had felt watched, as if someone was lurking, waiting. But when I looked back, the street was always empty. Despite my efforts to push those thoughts away, that night was different. Something made me constantly look over my shoulder, as if I expected to see someone, even though I knew there was no reason to. The streetlights flickered intermittently, struggling to stay on, while the wind blew dry leaves and dirt across the ground, giving the landscape a bleak and desolate air. Something inside me told me I shouldn't keep thinking about it, but I couldn't stop. There was a feeling in the air, like an invisible pressure pressing on my chest and forcing me to be alert. That's when I saw him. A man. A dark outline, blurry in the rain, barely visible in the distance, but I saw him clearly. He was standing about 2 blocks away, motionless. He was not moving. The flickering light of a streetlight illuminated his figure, revealing a tall, thin silhouette, his face completely covered by a hood. I paused for a moment, my heart racing, wondering if what I was seeing was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I couldn't see his eyes, but something about his posture made me feel like he was staring at me, as if he knew exactly where I was, as if he expected something from me. A shiver ran down my spine, and without further thought, I decided to continue on my way, picking up my pace. Every raindrop that hit my face seemed colder than usual, and the air was thick, icy, as if something was not right. The feeling of being watched did not disappear. On the contrary, it intensified. Although I knew there was no reason to look at him, my body, as if acting of its own volition, couldn't help but turn around to check if the man was still there. But when I did, he was gone. The street was empty, as before, and a sigh of relief escaped my lips. Still, that strange feeling remained. It wouldn't go away, and it pushed me to walk faster. At that moment, something made me stop in my tracks. A sound. It was subtle at first, barely a whisper. It sounded as if someone was following my footsteps, stepping in sync with me. I looked around, but there was no one. Only the rain, pounding hard on the asphalt, and the wind moving the dry leaves in its path. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, tiredness playing with me. But as I walked, the sound intensified. Every step, every breath, was accompanied by a closer rustle, as if someone was at my back. It was him. I knew instantly. The man. The one I had seen before. The one who was now following me. I couldn't see him, but the feeling of him stalking me became unbearable. I quickened my pace, almost running, not daring to look back. My mind was in chaos. What did he want? Why was he following me? Was it just a coincidence, or was something much more sinister going on? I finally reached my building. The stairs seemed endless, but my body, driven by fear, climbed them in 2 strides. Reaching the floor, I ran to my door, opened it urgently and slammed it shut, the sound of the wood fitting into the frame echoing in the silence of the night. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing pulse. Everything seemed in order inside the apartment, but something was wrong. There was something in the air, something I couldn't identify, as if the atmosphere was charged with an invisible tension. The living room lights were on, even though I had turned them off before leaving. A shiver ran down my spine. The place wasn't a mess, but everything was slightly out of place. The couch cushion was lying on the floor, and the curtains were open a little wider than usual, as if someone had touched them. But what really chilled my blood was what I saw on the kitchen table. A sheet of paper. At first I could barely make it out in the gloom, but it was there, with something written on it. I approached it slowly, with a sense of growing dread, while a part of me begged me not to do it, to get away from that table and close the door immediately. However, curiosity, that invisible force that pushes us to discover the unknown, compelled me to take the blade. Instantly, sweat began to run down my forehead, and my heart skipped a beat. There was no message, no clear word that I could understand. There were only 2 handwritten words, in a shaky handwriting that seemed to defy logic and common sense. I saw you. The letters stood out with terrifying clarity on the paper, as if they were there to haunt me. Fear gripped me, and my mind began to spin in circles. How was it possible? How did they know? How had they found me? The sound of the rain was still deafening, as if the storm had no intention of letting up. The feeling of being watched intensified even more. Something, or someone, was there, in my space, and I knew it for certain. My body, paralyzed by fear, was unresponsive. I looked around, searching for some sign that this was just paranoia, just a misperception. But the room was silent, and there was nothing out of place, except that one leaf. I decided to search the entire apartment, going through it as if I were looking for something invisible, something that might give me answers. But I found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone else had been there. Yet the feeling of danger persisted, like a cloud of uncertainty that permeated everything. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Hours passed and the rain did not stop. The storm continued its course without showing signs of exhaustion. Finally, I thought about calling the police, but immediately dismissed the idea. How could I explain to them that someone was following me, that someone was watching me, without being able to point to concrete evidence? What could they do with so little information? It was all so absurd. As I searched the apartment once more, my desperation grew. It was then that I reached the bathroom. As I looked in the mirror, my heart almost stopped. A reflection. Or so I thought at first. But it wasn't a reflection. It was the silhouette of a figure, as blurry as before but clearly visible. It was there behind me, in the mirror, as if watching me from the other side. I turned quickly, fear gripping my body, but the bathroom was empty. It was just me, just my rapid breathing and the sound of the rain pounding on the window. Fear completely overcame me. It wasn't simple paranoia. There was something real, something much darker than I could comprehend. At that moment, I understood one thing clearly. The real threat is not always something you can see. Sometimes what terrifies us is in the shadows, in the corners of what we consider safe. And sometimes, the greatest danger comes not from what is in front of us, but from what lurks from within our own minds. I'm not someone who likes to go out much, let alone be the center of attention. I live in a quiet neighborhood, away from the crowds, where the streets fade into a maze of similar houses. There is something strange about the peace of those places, something that has always made me feel uncomfortable, as if I was waiting for something bad to happen. What I never imagined is that this peace was the facade of something much darker. The story I'm about to tell has no traditional heroes or villains. There are no ghosts, no monsters, no supernatural beings. There are only people. Human beings with distorted intentions, driven by greed, desperation, and cruelty. It all happened 10 years ago, but I still feel the echoes of that night as if it were yesterday. It was a rainy afternoon. The rain pounded against my window with the insistence of a drum, echoing in my chest with each crack of thunder that broke the sky. That afternoon seemed as ordinary as any other, but fate has a strange way of marking decisive moments. I was in my apartment, alone as usual, when something jolted me out of my routine. A whisper, a distant sound, a murmur, coming from somewhere inside the building. It was nothing new. In such an old building, noises were frequent. But there was something about this sound that caught me. Something in the tonality of that conversation that made me pause. It was the conversation of two people, whose voices, though distorted by the walls and the rain, were clearly human. At first, I didn't understand anything. Vague words, fragments of sentences, as if they were talking about something trivial. But as I paid more attention, I began to pick up a few key words, and then the fog of confusion began to clear. All set. The pieces in place. No one is suspicious. He is overconfident. My heart skipped a beat. He must mean me. There was no doubt. My mind began to fill in the blanks, to string together the words I had heard. What piece were they talking about? What were they planning? Were they watching me? I didn't know how to react. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just stood there petrified, feeling the darkness of the situation slowly envelop me. And then, as if the conversation had been a message intended for me, it abruptly stopped. The murmuring ceased, and the silence hit me with the same intensity as the storm raging outside my window. I waited. I did so for minutes that felt like hours, but I heard nothing more. The tension I had built up hung in the air, even denser, more unsettling. I thought maybe I had imagined it all, that the rain had played a trick on me, that my mind had distorted the sounds. But then the message came. Not just any message, but an anonymous one, a notification on my phone, a cryptic message that slid across the screen without warning. We hear you. Trust no one. You are in danger. The countdown has begun. My breath hitched. Who was behind this? How did they know what I had heard? Questions piled up in my head like a tangle of disconnected wires, with no answers, only more doubts. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. The streets, the faces, the everyday interactions. But there was something in the air that had changed. Something made me look sideways at people. Something forced me to distrust every word, every look. The message echoed in my mind. Trust no one. And of course, I couldn't trust myself. I was beginning to doubt everything. Sometimes, going out to the store or going to work, I felt as if something was following me, as if I was being watched. Every time someone approached me, my heart would race, my hands would become cold. I began to see patterns where there were none, to notice small details that would have gone unnoticed before. Fleeting glances, smiles that didn't seem genuine, conversations interrupted as I entered a room. Was it paranoia, or was it reality starting to crumble around me? The rain continued to fall with the same force, drilling through the roof of my apartment, creating a perfect backdrop for the dark thoughts that invaded my mind. What was I to do? Ignore the message? Go on with my life as if nothing had happened? Or should I try to alert the authorities, even if it meant putting myself in their crosshairs? My fear was not only that something would happen to me, but that, in trying to expose what I had discovered, I might involve other people. It could drag in those who didn't even know they were part of something much bigger. The feeling that something was falling apart in my life grew with each passing day. At times, I found myself watching people with unbearable distrust, searching their faces for signs of complicity. And worst of all, I began to see things I couldn't explain. Conversations that were interrupted as I passed by, muffled laughter when I entered a room. People started to look at me as if they knew something they shouldn't. At first, I tried to rationalize it away. I thought they were just coincidences, that my mind, fueled by fear and uncertainty, was creating stories where none existed. As the days passed, however, the signs became clearer and more disturbing. Casual encounters with neighbors became tense situations. In my building, everyone seemed to know more than they were saying. How could that be possible? How could I be so sure that nothing I was seeing was real? The people I once knew and had friendly interactions with now seemed different, distant. Their faces had been transformed into masks, and behind every gesture, secrets were hidden. No one said anything openly, but the atmosphere was thick, charged with palpable tension. When I looked into the eyes of others, I saw a shadow of distrust. And the worst thing was that I didn't know if that shadow was there because I had created it, or if something was really going on. One night, after a particularly hectic day, when I was already on the verge of despair, I received another message. This time the tone was different, more direct. The countdown is over. It's now or never. Was it a threat? A warning? I didn't know. But the weight of that sentence crushed my chest, and for the first time in weeks, I made a decision. I decided to act. I could no longer live in fear, in constant doubt that I was trapped in something much bigger than myself. I couldn't let that shadow surround me forever. I went to the police. I explained to them what I had heard, what I had felt. But what happened next, though I thought it would free me from the burden of doubt, only plunged me deeper into the abyss. They took me seriously at first. They asked me for details. They asked me questions about the voices, about what I had heard. But when I told them about the anonymous message, about the warning, their attitude changed. They also began to look at me with suspicion. Was it true what I was saying, or was it just paranoia? Finally, after hours of interrogation, they let me go, without further explanation, just a piece of advice. Go back to your normal life. Don't get involved in things you don't understand. I left the police station feeling more alone than ever, more lost. The warning, the threat. Were they real, or just the product of a paranoid mind? I didn't know then, and I don't know now. What I learned after all this time is that life is full of little games. Games of power, of control, of manipulation. And the worst part is that sometimes you don't even know you're participating in one until it's too late. What baffles me is that, despite everything, I never heard the original conversation again. The murmurs disappeared, and with them, the feeling that something big was about to happen. However, the shadow that began to grow in my life never faded. It lingered, latent in every corner, in every glance. 10 years ago, I overheard a conversation. I didn't know at the time that it was the beginning of a path from which I could never return. People, those around me, became shadows, strangers I had to fear. And although the rain no longer beats with the same intensity on my window, fear and doubt are still my company. Sometimes I think that the greatest enemy is not those who stalk you from the shadows, but those who present themselves with a smile, those who seem familiar. In the end, the real terror is not what lurks in the dark, but what lurks in the people you think you know. The game I started 10 years ago remains, somehow, unresolved, because the danger never ends. The fear persists, and the question is always floating around. Who is behind all this? Maybe I will never know, but one thing is certain. Mistrust is a prison from which it is difficult to get out, and no matter how hard the rain falls. The rain lashed the windshield of my car with such fury that I could barely see beyond a few meters. Each drop was like a threat, hitting the glass with unbearable insistence. My mind couldn't get away from the call, that call that came at dusk, as I traveled down an empty, winding road that seemed to have no end. An unknown number, with a cold, calculating tone, had spoken. There was no need for words. The only instruction was clear. Follow the road to the end, and you will know the truth. Nothing more. That was all. At first I thought it was a prank, one of those anonymous calls from some stranger looking to scare me for fun. However, something inside me told me it was not. The voice was too serious, and the echo in the earpiece felt distant, as if they were watching me from some dark corner. In my chest, a knot of anxiety tightened with every kilometer I went. The road seemed endless, a blurred horizon, marked by the darkness and the rain that kept falling. At every turn, I felt the pressure of not being alone, as if someone was following me from a distance, as if the road itself were a tunnel trapping me. I thought it was just the accumulated stress of driving under those conditions, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. Something was not right. Something was going to happen. The headlight of my car illuminated just a few meters ahead, but the rain and the darkness blurred everything, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. The trees on the sides of the road loomed like fuzzy shadows, and the wind whirred, carrying with it a mixture of cold and dampness. As I drove on, each kilometer seemed to get longer, as if the road would never come to an end. I felt trapped in a loop, but my curiosity wouldn't let me stop. What did the call mean? Who was the person on the other end of the line? What happened next, I don't remember clearly. A sharp turn, a skid on the wet road, and the car began to skid. The feeling of lost control was fleeting, but enough for the vehicle to violently roll over. The impact was brutal. Everything went black. I felt no pain, only a pressure in my chest and a thud that echoed in my head. The darkness swallowed everything, and in it disappeared any notion of time or space. I awoke in a place that initially looked like a hospital. At first, the confusion was total. I had no idea who I was or how I had ended up there. I was surrounded by white walls and a strange, cold feeling that made me feel even more lost. My head hurt as if someone had hit me with a hammer, and my thoughts scattered like broken fragments. I tried to remember something, anything, but my mind was empty, as if it had been erased. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. Something told me I shouldn't trust anyone. Not even the doctors who came to my room. Their blurry faces and muffled voices were distant to me, as if they didn't belong to my reality. It was as if I was trapped in a dream from which I could not wake up, a distorted nightmare in which the answers never came. Days passed and confusion turned to despair. No one would tell me anything concrete about my accident. There were no documents, no clear records. I couldn't remember my name, my past, or how I had gotten there. There was a constant feeling of discomfort, as if I was being watched, lurking in the shadows. And worst of all was the feeling that no one wanted to tell me the truth. Little by little, fragments of my memory began to return, but in a strange way. They were not clear memories, but like distorted echoes emerging at irregular intervals. Fragmented images of my former life, faces I couldn't identify, places I didn't know if they were real or the product of my fragmented mind. And that call, that damned call that kept echoing deep inside me, like a constant reminder that there was something else behind it all. One night, as I was wandering the halls of the hospital, in an attempt to escape the feeling of claustrophobia that was consuming me, I saw something in the reflection of a broken window. It was not my face. It was a strange but familiar face. My eyes were empty, as if someone else had placed them there, and a crooked smile tugged at the corners of my lips. I turned away quickly, my heart pounding. Who was this person? Why was he or she reflecting back at me? A cold sweat ran down my back, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew in my chest. The face in the reflection was not mine, but somehow I felt it belonged to me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to reconstruct my identity. I searched through documents, through records, but there was nothing. No one knew who I was, or at least no one would tell me. People avoided me, and the few who approached me did so cautiously, as if they feared something. The doctors seemed more interested in my empty answers than in curing me. Something in their look told me that I should not trust them. It was then that I started receiving letters, always in white envelopes with no return address. At first I thought they were notes from some stranger, but I soon realized that the words were too precise, too calculated. Each letter told me about my life before the accident, what I had done, what I had lost. They described me in details that only someone who knew me very well could know. No one else could have that information. It was not possible. The letters arrived periodically, as if someone was controlling the pace of my recovery, but not in a benign way, but with a clear intention to manipulate my memories. Anguish consumed me. How could they know so much about me if I remembered nothing? The only possible answer was that someone was watching me, that someone was manipulating me from the shadows, pulling the strings of my life without my escape. I was trapped in a cruel game, where I was just a piece in the hands of an unknown being who was watching me, who knew me too well and who seemed to have everything under control. Memories began to come again, more clearly, but still fragmented. Images of a man, a faceless face, who seemed to be ever present in the corners of my mind. He was the one who had spoken on the call. I knew it for certain. He was the one who had pushed me to the accident, the one who had left me here, trapped in a limbo with no way out. As my memory became clearer, so did the truth. What had happened to me was no accident. I had been manipulated. I had been made to forget, and most disturbingly, I had been replaced. The man on the call, he had not only played with my mind, he had supplanted me. He had put me in his trap with macabre precision. It was as if I had been an experiment, a game in which I was nothing more than a piece of a puzzle that someone else had put together. My memories, my identity, everything had been distorted, and for a moment, I feared I could never escape that manipulation. The terror was not the idea of being hunted, but the idea of having been stripped of my very essence. The idea that a man with a single gesture could destroy everything that made me, me. Everything I had thought I knew about myself was a lie. It was years before I could fully reconstruct my past, but the damage was already done. Fear, distrust, and the feeling that I could never be the same had settled deep inside me. What happened after my recovery doesn't matter. What matters, what remains, is the lesson I learned. The human mind is much more vulnerable than we think, and we, as beings, are more fragile than we would like to admit. The worst thing is not that we might be hunted or stalked by a killer, but that, at some point, we might be by someone who knows us so well that they can erase everything we are, everything we have been, and replace it with something else, something we are not, something we never chose to be. In the end, we become the echoes of our own memories, and we ask ourselves, who was I really? And what was left of me when I could no longer trust even my own mind? 13 years have passed since that night. 13 years since everything I thought I knew about life crumbled before my eyes, leaving only ruins and unanswered questions. I can still remember the rain hitting the window panes, the darkness of the street like a blanket that devoured the world. But what really stuck in my mind was not the storm, not even the threat hanging over me. It was the feeling that someone I didn't know, was watching me, studying me, as if I were prey waiting to be hunted. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that the man stalking me was not just a stranger, but a distorted reflection of myself, a broken mirror of my own fears and obsessions. It all began one autumn afternoon. The rain did not stop, as if the whole sky had decided to pour down to earth. I was in my apartment, a small, austere place, barely enough space to breathe, but comfortable enough to think of nothing but my own routine. I had returned from work, somewhat late, tired as usual. and was preparing for a quiet night. Or so I thought. The first time I felt something wasn't right was when I saw that figure, that shadow in the window. At first, I thought it was an illusion. The darkness outside played with the light from the lamp in the corner, but then I saw it more clearly. A man. I couldn't see his face, just the silhouette silhouetted against the rain lashing the glass. I thought maybe it was someone passing by, someone who had taken refuge under the canopy. But what disturbed me was the stillness with which he stood there. It didn't move, not an inch. In the city there are always people, and in a storm like that, even more so. But no one would stand in front of a window, at the mercy of the elements, for so long. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Look through the glass to try to see who it was? I decided on the latter, but when I approached, the figure was gone. Only the rain and the distant sound of thunder remained. I felt not relief, but bewilderment. I wondered if it had been just my mind, playing tricks on me in that dark night. However, the feeling persisted. It wasn't simple paranoia, it was something much deeper, something I couldn't explain, but which was dragging me deeper and deeper into a tunnel with no way out. The next day, as I was walking to work, I saw him again. It was in the distance, on a corner, standing next to a building. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence, that it was just someone else. But that figure, that silhouette, could not be a mistake. I knew instantly. It was him, the same man, and his presence filled me with an indescribable terror. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, watching. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't have a score to settle with anyone. But he was watching me, and that made my blood run cold. Throughout the following days, his presence became more palpable. I saw him closer, sometimes in the streets I crossed, sometimes in the stores I passed, always at a distance, always without getting too close. But the worst thing was not that he was following me, but the feeling that, somewhere, he knew me, studied me. My every move was being watched, as if he knew what I was going to do before I did it. And worse, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. An invisible but omnipresent shadow that surrounded me. A black hole that absorbed everything I thought, my every little gesture. A couple of weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was inside my house. The apartment door was closed, the windows intact, but the air felt different, charged with a strange pressure. In the corner of the room, near the window, I could see the shadow again, that same figure. But this time, it wasn't just a peripheral vision. It was there, clearly. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. A man, standing right at the edge of my bed, staring, unmoving. I felt an overwhelming cold, as if something inside me was breaking. My body was paralyzed, as if I couldn't move, but my mind was working a mile a minute. I didn't understand what was happening, why this person was there. It didn't make sense. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I could only stare. And that's when I understood, with total clarity, that he didn't want to talk. He didn't want anything from me, except my fear. Time passed. The rain did not stop. Every day I felt his presence more and more that feeling of being watched, of being a prisoner in my own life. At night, the lights in my apartment flickered strangely, as if someone was manipulating them. I felt that my home was no longer a refuge, but a place where someone else was dictating the rules. I felt trapped in a bubble of terror, as if all my actions were predestined, as if living no longer depended on me, but on a stranger who was always one step ahead. Things got worse. One morning on my way out, I found a letter on my apartment door. There was no return address, just a handwritten message in precise handwriting. I see you. I'm waiting for you. You won't regret it. My breathing quickened. I felt as if I were caught in an invisible net, more and more tense, more and more on edge. I didn't know what he wanted from me, or how I had gotten there, but I felt that everything I did, every step, every breath was being watched. What kind of man was this? What did he want from me? And why was he so sure he would find me anywhere in the city? That same afternoon, as I was walking through the neighborhood, I saw him once again. He was on the corner, as always, watching. And then, for the first time, I understood that what terrified me was not only that he was following me, but that there was something else. He didn't want to kill me outright, no. He wanted me to live with this fear. He wanted me to live with this fear. He wanted me to live with the knowledge that I could not escape, that I was slowly sinking into a nightmare from which I could not wake up. The harassment continued for weeks. Closer and closer, more and more precise. It got to a point where I could no longer trust my own steps. I felt the world crumbling around me, my life disintegrating into 1,000 pieces. One day, when I returned home, I found him inside, waiting for me. He was no longer watching me from the darkness of the street. Now he was in my home, in my space. He was just watching me. The nightmare had become flesh. And worst of all, I no longer knew if what I was seeing was real or a product of my mind, which was beginning to lose the ability to differentiate between what was happening and what I feared would happen. My reaction was impulsive, desperate. I thought of nothing but surviving, of stopping that threat. I confronted him, but the man said nothing. There were no words, just a cold stare, as if he was satisfied with my terror. In that instant, I felt something break inside me. I understood that I was losing control of the situation, that not only was he stalking me, but that I myself had begun to lose my way. I no longer knew if my life was a story I was writing, or if he was actually dictating it. The police arrived minutes later, and he was arrested. They didn't say much, only that he was linked to several harassment cases in the city. During the days that followed, I was interrogated, held for 3 days as part of the investigations. But what surprised me most was to discover that this man had been following several people before me. And the most disturbing thing, no one knew how or why he chose his victims. It was as if there was no pattern, just a need to impose his will on those he targeted. He was a specter, a shadow that hunted for no reason. Today, 13 years later, everything has changed. My life is different, or at least it seems different. I have learned to control my fears, to live with the shadow of that man who haunted me for so long. But the truth is that what torments me most is not his presence, but the lesson he left me. Because now I understand something I never imagined. No matter how far you try to escape, sometimes the real danger is within yourself, in your fears, in your obsessions, in everything that consumes you and turns you into prey, even when you have no idea what is hunting you. The man who followed me was not just a stalker. He was a reflection of everything I was afraid to be, everything I was afraid to face. Because sometimes the worst monsters come not from without, but from within. And now I know that, even though the storm is gone, the shadows are still lurking. I am Francisco, a public relations graduate. For a couple of years, my life was marked by a constant sense of danger, as if every step I took could be my last. In that time, I became someone completely different from the one I was before. A more cautious man, more cunning, and above all, someone who lived under the constant threat of a stranger whom I called the stalker. That man who decided to ruin my life for not giving in to his demands. Today, after 4 years, I can tell this story with the peace of mind that he is behind bars. But do not forget that what I'm about to tell you is not an ordinary story. It is something that changed me forever. It all started one rainy afternoon. Like so many others, when I was returning home after a long day of work. I had decided to walk through the streets of the city. The torrential rain was not an obstacle for me. On the contrary, it offered me a certain calmness. The sound of the drops hitting the sidewalks and the roofs of the buildings gave me a sense of isolation, as if the world had been plunged into absolute silence, where only I and my usual route existed. I lived in a central neighborhood, surrounded by skyscrapers and constant bustle. Although the traffic and people on the sidewalks never stopped, the streets seemed emptier during those storms. I, as always, took the same route to get to my apartment, a small unit in a multi-story building. But that night, something changed. Something I couldn't see, but I felt it. As I reached the door of my building, I noticed something strange. A small, crumpled piece of paper, barely visible under one of the flower pots at the entrance. It wasn't a letter or something ordinary. It was a handwritten message, but I didn't stop to read it at the time. It was soaked, almost washed away by the rain. But there was something about it that left me with an uneasy feeling. I picked it up, but before I went inside, I decided it would be best to put it aside. I didn't think too much about it at first. City life had taught me to ignore the little annoyances, the chance encounters, the details that didn't deserve attention. But the weeks that followed began to prove that my instincts had failed me. The man had begun to appear in the most unusual places, in crowds, in cafes, in corner stores, in every nook and cranny where I walked. He was not an obvious presence. It didn't approach or speak to me, but its signals were clear. An object placed in my car, always in the same place, but never exactly the same. A piece of paper, a pen, a lighter. Things that had no value to me, but that left the seed of doubt in my mind. And the looks. Whenever I turned around, I could feel his eyes on my back, the feeling of being watched without anyone being around. No one saw him, but I knew he was there, lurking. At first I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence. Sometimes I would find myself in the corner of the park and suddenly I would see him, walking leisurely, but always in my direction. But it wasn't a chance encounter. He seemed to know exactly when to appear and what to do. A movement, a signal, and then he would disappear, as if his presence was part of a game. My days began to be filled with paranoia. I couldn't stop looking back, checking every corner, every shadow that lengthened down the street. The signs he left, though trivial to the naked eye, unhinged me. Small details, like a phone call from an unknown number that hung up as soon as I answered, or an empty text message with only a couple of characters. Occasionally, I would find handwritten messages in places like the subway station, always with the same pattern. They were short, ambiguous, but always with an address for me. One afternoon, as I was returning from an important meeting, I noticed something different. The city lights were flickering intermittently due to the storm, and the rain was falling with such intensity that the street seemed to crumble under its weight. I decided to take a shortcut through a less traveled area of the neighborhood, a small alley between two old buildings that connected to my main street. It wasn't the usual route, but the noise of the cars and the splashing in the puddles of the avenues made me more uneasy than the silence of the alley. But something was not right. As I entered the alley, I felt a pressure in the air, as if I were sinking into an enclosed space, an oppressive sensation I couldn't explain. As if someone was beside me, right behind me, and I didn't have the courage to turn around. The rain was still falling hard. The echo of the drops hitting the concrete made any noise amplified, and the atmosphere became denser and denser with every step. When I reached the end of the alley, the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked around, trying to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing. Then I noticed that the door of an old warehouse was slightly ajar. It was strange. I had never seen that door open before. The building looked uninhabited, but that night it seemed to have a life of its own. As I approached, a flash of light illuminated the inside of the store, and there, on the threshold, I saw something that chilled my blood. It was a hooded figure, his face partially covered, but what shook me the most was what he was holding in his hands, a cell phone. He was recording, filming, as if he was waiting for me to approach. At that moment, I understood that it had not been a coincidence. He had been following me all that time, my every move. The simple fact that he knew where I would be passing that night, that he had anticipated my arrival, made me realize that I was caught in a dangerous game, one that I could not control. My mind panicked, but something inside me told me I had to flee. I didn't ask questions. I didn't hang around to see what happened next. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. My breathing quickened with each step, and the sound of heels on wet pavement was the only thing that echoed in my ears. I ran, without stopping, until I reached my apartment. That night, I could not sleep. The feeling that I was being watched never left me. From that moment on, my life changed completely. Every day was a constant battle against my own fear. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't rest. Although the stalker never appeared again so directly, his traces were marked on me forever. It took weeks, then months, before I finally decided to report everything I had experienced. It was a long, tedious, and extremely distressing process. I talked to psychologists, lawyers, even the police. But the first attempts were futile. No one seemed to take me seriously. Everyone thought I was overreacting, that I was simply paranoid. But as more details came to light, the case began to take shape. The objects in my car, the ambiguous messages, the security cameras that recorded a man lurking near my apartment, it all began to fit together. Finally, he was arrested. The sense of relief was overwhelming. The man I had called the stalker could no longer harm me, but I was still a victim of my own mind. The shadow of his presence had settled so deeply in me that I could not free myself from it immediately. Moments of panic were still part of my life. Paranoia followed me everywhere. Suddenly, every strange noise, every shadow in the hallway made me think that he was near, that he hadn't left yet. What I learned from all this is that the greatest danger is not always the one you can see, the one you can touch, or the one you can escape. Sometimes the greatest enemy is within ourselves, in our own perception of what is happening. Fear can take over our mind with such intensity that it changes us completely, consumes us. It makes us see monsters where there are none. It makes us prisoners of our own anguish. Life goes on, but there will always be something inside me that reminds me of that time. The sound of the rain, the shadows on the corners, the feeling of not being alone, the constant gaze of someone who does not want to be seen. Today, 4 years later, I move on, but with a lesson I cannot forget. Fear cannot always be faced head-on. Sometimes the best strategy is to learn to recognize its traces and move forward, knowing that the worst part is always the one we let ourselves be carried away, without realizing it, by our own shadow. Never forget that what you don't see can be more dangerous than what you can touch. The sound of the rain hitting the roof of my tent was constant, deafening, as if the sky was overflowing its fury on the earth. For years, the noise of the storm was something I had learned to ignore. In my pawn shop, the crackling of water on the roof was more of a background sound than something worthy of attention. My business was always quiet, for the most part. I welcomed all kinds of people, from antique collectors to those looking for quick cash for an item of value. The arrangements were simple, the rules clear. I would lend money in exchange for an item of value, and if the borrower failed to pay, the object became my property. It was a simple job, or at least it was until I met him. It was October 10th, 2023. A date that was burned into my mind, a date I could never erase. That day, the storm was especially strong. The wind howled furiously outside the windows, and the rain seemed to fall as if the world itself was about to collapse. The store was empty, and the sound of the water crashing against the glass seemed to accentuate the silence in which I found myself. But then, that door opened. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk in looking for quick cash. What was unusual was the man who appeared. Tall, dressed in a black leather jacket and a hat that almost completely covered his face. He didn't look like a collector or someone who was looking for anything particularly valuable, but he walked straight up to the counter, as if he knew exactly what he wanted. The rain had soaked him, and the scent of dampness and wet earth he brought with him filled the air. He asked me for a loan. It wasn't like the other times. There were no conversations about what to pawn or discussions about the interest rate. No, the man already had something in mind. He pulled out an old pocket pistol, so worn it looked like something out of a 1940s movie, and placed it on the table. No one had ever done anything like that before. The presence of that gun, combined with his vacant stare, made me hesitate, but the need to keep my business afloat prompted me not to overthink it. I did what I always did. I gave him the money. Something inside me told me I shouldn't do it, but the temptation to close a transaction at that moment, in the middle of the storm, clouded my judgment. The man assured me he would come back for the money, but didn't tell me when. At first, I thought it had all been just another transaction. However, the atmosphere in my store changed that day. It became denser, more tense. That night, as the rain continued to lash my roof and the drops fell hard, I felt that something in me had become unsettled. That uneasy feeling, that hunch that never went away. Over the next few days, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. If that man had been more than just a loan shark who had needed some money. What happened next was worse than I had imagined. 3 days passed, and that's when the man returned. This time, he was not alone. The wind was blowing even harder, and the rain seemed to fall even more relentlessly. I saw him enter with a couple of men, all with their faces covered by balaclavas, and that look, that same empty look, more penetrating than ever. One of the men had something in his hands, but I couldn't see what it was. As they approached the counter, the tension increased. It was not the same atmosphere as the first time. The room had become oppressive, as if an invisible weight surrounded us all. My pulse raced, and for an instant I questioned whether I had been right to keep that damned business. The man didn't need to say anything for me to understand what was going on. He hadn't come to return the money. He hadn't come to get his item back. He had come for something far worse. Time passed, but the threat didn't go away. The anonymous calls began, the text messages with veiled threats, the shadows creeping around the corners of my field of vision. Every time I left the store, I felt someone's invisible gaze following me, and when I got home, my youngest son would ask me, with an innocence that tore at me, if I was okay. That anxiety was growing inside me, burning me, tearing me apart. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about his cold, empty eyes, as if he had nothing to lose. It was as if he was stalking me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to take the next step. A week after their last encounter, I decided to take action. In an act of desperation, I turned to the police. I went to a nearby station, explained the situation, showed proof of the threats. But, as is often the case in such cases, they did nothing. The threats were ambiguous. There was not enough evidence. There was nothing concrete. They told me that they could not do anything without a formal complaint, but that, in any case, I should stay calm and wait for it to be resolved. I could not wait. I knew that my life and that of my family were in danger. That same night, when I closed the store, I felt that something was about to happen. My son was at home, asleep. But when I arrived, I saw him, and for an instant, I almost thought it was all just a nightmare. The house was empty. My wife was gone, and the silence was palpable. The anguish choked me immediately. I ran to my son's room, and there I found him. He was lying on the floor, unconscious, with a wound on his head, a dark blood stain on his pillow. The man had come to my house. The storm had stopped, but the weight of what had happened fell on me like a heavy blanket. That feeling of horror, of helplessness, was unbearable. What did this man want? Why had he come to my family? No one seemed to have any answers. My son was in the hospital for several days, but miraculously survived, though not without sequelae. What left me scarred, however, was not his recovery, but the fact that, despite all that had happened, the man had not disappeared. I knew I could trust no one. That fear was no longer intangible. He was no longer safe. Throughout the months that followed, I tried to move on, even though I couldn't shake the fear. Sometimes I would hear footsteps outside the store, see shadows in the windows, feel like I was being watched. It was as if I was trapped in an endless cycle of fear, of anxiety. The man never appeared again, but I always knew he was still there, waiting for the right moment. Today, looking back, I understand something I never wanted to accept. This man, the one who looked like a shadow of the storm, was not just a figure of terror. He was a reminder. A reminder that we cannot always predict what will happen in our lives. The decisions we make, no matter how simple they may seem, can have consequences we never imagined. No matter how far you think you can run, no matter how strong you feel you are. There are times when life confronts us with our own vulnerability. Sometimes I find myself wondering how I could have been so blind. How could I have failed to see that this loan was not just an exchange of money and items? As time passed, fear grew inside me like an unstoppable plague, a feeling that would never subside. The nightmare was not over, not even with the storm calmed. Now, in telling this story, I don't expect you to understand what I went through. I don't even know if I will ever fully understand. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, the worst storm is not the one that falls from the sky, but the one that rages inside us when there is no way to escape. The rain has finally subsided, but the anxiety is still intact. And I, like all of us who have ever faced a real threat, know that there will always be something lurking, something waiting for the right moment to remind us how fragile we are. The rain was relentless that night, lashing the windows of my apartment with a force that seemed to have no end. Each drop crashed against the glass with the same dull, continuous sound, as if each impact was trying to break something in me. It wasn't just the noise that bothered me, but the weight of everything that had been happening over the past few months. Things were not going well. In fact, everything had gone awry so quickly and so brutally that I was having trouble recognizing how I had gotten there. I'm a bank manager, which at first seemed like a good position, a stability that anyone in my position would value. And I did, of course. The first few years were quiet, a dream of money, recognition, and power. My wise decisions had led the entity to generate large figures, and my name became synonymous with success within the institution. I was admired by my superiors, my colleagues respected me, and the future looked bright. But like everything good in life, my success attracted the one I least expected, Juan. Juan was one of my colleagues, someone who had worked alongside me for a long time, an ordinary guy, nothing out of the ordinary, but with a voracious ambition, an ambition that, over time, started to become dangerous. At first, his comments were more or less harmless. He talked about my way of doing things, how I seemed to have everything under control. It wasn't a friendly attitude, but it wasn't worrisome either. However, something in his gaze made me feel uncomfortable, as if he was always overwatching, as if he wanted something more than just being there. Over time, Juan's little hints began to become more direct. At first, they were subtle doubts about my decisions and projects. He said I had taken unnecessary risks, that I had been too optimistic with some of my gambles. And although he never told me outright, I began to notice a change in the way his eyes sparkled when he talked about my accomplishments. There seemed to be something else, something hidden, something that I couldn't quite understand, but that troubled me deeply. The problems began so subtly that it was hard for me to realize how deeply they were affecting my work life. A project that I had turned in months in advance, one that had been presented as a triumph for the institution, was suddenly reviewed by Juan. He insinuated that there were irregularities, that not everything was clear, that perhaps I had made the wrong decisions. Those words seemed unfounded, but people are easily influenced, and Juan's influence over some board members was not long in coming. At first, I resisted. I thought that everything would pass, that the truth would prevail, but it did not. Little by little, confidence in my ability began to fade. Rumors about me began to circulate in the corridors of the bank, in the cafes of the city. I began to receive anonymous emails, messages insinuating that my time at the bank was coming to an end. The insinuations were not vague. The messages were direct, almost derogatory. They said that Juan was gaining ground, that he had contacts at the highest levels, and that my accomplishments meant nothing if someone with more power wanted to replace me. Worst of all, I could not find the source of the rumors, nor any way to disprove them. Every time I tried to defend myself, my arguments seemed weaker, my position more precarious. The breaking point came one evening as I was returning from the office. I was tired, immersed in dark thoughts that terrified me more than any direct threat. I was walking down the hallway of my building, my mind completely engrossed, when suddenly I heard something. A faint creaking, a sound of footsteps that shouldn't have been there. I stopped in my tracks but saw no one. I thought maybe it was my mind playing tricks, the result of tiredness and the rain that was pounding furiously on the windows of the building. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, but as I opened the door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was not right. The air was colder than usual, and just then, the hallway light went out, plunging the place into a dense, almost palpable darkness. The feeling of discomfort enveloped me completely, but the worst was yet to come. As I entered, I realized that something had changed. My living room window was open, a window I always kept closed, locked, as a precaution. A shiver ran through my body, and my heart began to beat faster. I felt the weight of threat in the air, though at the time I didn't know if anyone was there or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The dim glow of my cell phone light was my only companion as I cautiously scanned the house. Every shadow seemed to move on its own, every corner concealed something. It was then that I saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner of the room, his silhouette barely visible, almost as if fading into the darkness. I don't need to explain to you what I felt at that moment, a terror so deep that it paralyzed me. The figure did not move, but its presence was undeniable. I knew who it was. I knew he wasn't there by accident. Juan had been in my house. The creaking of the floor beneath my feet made me react. I had no time to think. I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed the phone, but I didn't know what to do. Call the police? How would I explain what had happened? I had no proof. I had nothing but a feeling of fear and the certainty that, at that moment, my life was in danger. I hid in the hallway, out of sight of the window that I now saw as a risk. The rain was still falling with the same force, pounding the glass furiously. My mind was so racing that I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I was really living that nightmare. I felt a pressure in my chest, the sensation that something terrible was about to happen. And suddenly the door opened with a dry sound. It wasn't Juan, but the feeling that someone was coming towards me was unmistakable. Adrenaline pushed me to act without thinking. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the first object I found, a small lamp with which I would try to defend myself. But when I reached the hallway, I stopped. Something didn't fit. There was no trace of Juan. The door that had been left ajar had not been opened by him. My mind began to spin, analyzing all the possibilities, but none of them seemed convincing. Hours passed. The rain never stopped. The feeling of danger did not leave me. Uncertainty consumed me, and the next morning, I decided to call the police. At first, they took me for crazy. There was no evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses. All I had was my word against his, and everyone knew that Juan had more influence than I did. What followed was a spiral of sabotage. My projects were disqualified, my accomplishments disproved, my reputation went to the ground. No one would listen to me. John's face was everywhere, hidden behind a triumphant smile that no one seemed to question. Finally, time did what justice could not. For months I had been living with the latent threat that someday Juan might try something worse. But that night, fear and paranoia played a trick on me. I had made so many assumptions, had been so obsessed with the idea of his attack, that I had forgotten the simplest thing. The human mind is capable of so much more than what a threat can show. Today, 7 years later, I can say that not only those who escape danger survive, but those who are wise enough not to be trapped by fear. Juan is no longer in my life, nor in the bank, nor in the city. But the price was high. I lost my confidence, my peace, and for a long time, my humanity. What I learned, what I really learned, is that it's not about running from danger. It's not about avoiding the direct threat. It's about how you face the darkness inside you, when the storm is no longer just external, but also internal. And, although the rains may subside, what remains is what you have made of the storm. And, above all, what you have done with yourself by having survived it. The rains will continue to fall, but I am no longer the same. The rain never stopped pounding on the windows that night. The sound of the drops, like hammering on a drum, covered every other noise. There was something sinister in the way it fell, as if the storm itself was so caught up in its fury that it could not escape its own chaos. The wind, like a steady whisper, was creeping through the cracks in the doors and windows, and the sound of the storm mingled with a rustle coming from some corner of the house. That house. The same house that had seen me grow up. The same house that took me in when I returned after several years of absence. But it wasn't the same house as before. It wasn't. I moved back to this place seeking solace, thinking I would find peace after all that had happened. Somehow, I thought my return to this forgotten place would erase the scars of the past. However, it did not. It was not peace that awaited me, but a danger in the shadows. A danger that was becoming closer and more tangible. The storm had started an hour earlier, but it wasn't the storm that had me on edge. No, it was the constant feeling that someone was watching me. At first I thought it was paranoia, a normal reaction after the years of stress and events that had happened to me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling. The same feeling that had been with me for years and that I couldn't shake. It wasn't paranoia. It was something else, something much worse. It all started years ago when I decided to move to another place, to get away from everything I knew. Maybe it was a way to run away, to try to find myself again. I had been living alone, miles away from my family and friends, when a man appeared in my life. A man who, apparently, had many details about me, about my past, about the people I had known. A man who, at the time, seemed so familiar, so trustworthy. This man posed as someone I knew. It was impressive the way he managed to imitate gestures, behaviors, details of people who used to be close to me. He would say things that no one else knew, things that only the closest friends shared. He was so well prepared that I came to trust him without hesitation. Trust was built quickly, without me even realizing it. But it wasn't the trust that led me to tragedy. It was the betrayal that followed. As the months went by, I began to notice that things didn't fit. There was something strange in his movements, something unsettling in his gaze. He was always aware of my movements, and the worst thing was that he didn't seem to do anything but wait, waiting for me to make a mistake. I understood it too late. He had infiltrated my life not out of friendship, but for another purpose, a much more sinister one. The betrayal unveiled itself one night, so abruptly and violently that I could not immediately understand it. It was a blow to the head, a blast of pain followed by darkness. When I awoke, I was in a room I didn't recognize, tied to a chair. The man who had been my friend was no longer there, but he had left something else behind, a sense of impending danger lingering in the air. As the days passed, I began to receive threats. These were no ordinary threats, no simple message or phone call. They were letters, carefully written, with details that only he knew. They described what was going to happen to me, how I would find myself trapped in a no-win situation. Each letter was signed with a different name, but the tone was always the same: threatening, cold, calculating. At first I tried to take it as something passing, like a bad joke. But I soon realized that things were not as I thought. The letters became more frequent, the threats more specific. They said things like, "We're watching you," or "We'll find you wherever you are." My paranoia grew with each new letter. The feeling that I was being followed, that something was lurking at every step I took, became unbearable. I could no longer sleep peacefully. I could no longer walk down the street without looking over my shoulder, without feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching me. I moved house several times, but it didn't matter. It was always the same pattern. New threats, new letters, new signs that I couldn't escape. In every city I moved to, the letters came. Every job I took, there was something that made me feel watched. The man never failed to appear in my life, even if he didn't physically appear. His words were ever present. His threats stalked every corner of my existence. At first, I tried to ask for help, to report the threats to the police. But they could do nothing. There was not enough evidence, nothing concrete. And besides, something inside me told me that if I told them the whole story, if I told them about the man, about what had happened years ago, they would see me as paranoid. They would see me as someone incapable of handling the pressure of their own mind. And the idea that they would think I was crazy terrified me more than any threat. Today, after years of living in fear, I have reached a point where I can no longer differentiate whether the threats are real or whether my mind has begun to play tricks on me. Every sound in the house makes me jump. Every shadow makes me doubt if it is a stranger or just my own reflection. There is no peace in my days anymore. Anxiety consumes me, and the nights feel endless. I have learned to sleep in short intervals without closing my eyes completely, expecting that, at any moment, something or someone will cross my path. I have become a shadow of my former self, a person who doesn't know if he lives under constant danger or if the real threat is inside his mind. But there is one thing I have learned. It's not just the betrayal that hurts. It's not just the fact that a man has infiltrated my life and destroyed it. The worst thing, the scariest thing, is that I don't know if I could ever trust anyone anymore. I don't know if I could ever trust myself. Fear, that constant fear, has eaten away all that was left of my inner peace. Worst of all, I know the man is still there, waiting. Every night, when the storm hits the window, when the wind slips through the cracks, I feel that I am not alone, that I never was. I don't know what the future holds. Every time I look out the window, I wonder if I will see him standing there, in the middle of the storm, watching me from a distance. If I hear a door creak, I feel that maybe he is inside the house, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for the exact moment to finish what he started. That feeling accompanies me, relentless, like the storm that does not cease. I can't help thinking that, somewhere, something or someone is still lurking, waiting. This fear is not something new. I have lived it for years, but now, in the stillness of the house, in the rain and the wind, I feel it intensify. Perhaps I have never really been free. Maybe the trap he set, though it seems invisible, has always been there, lurking. Sometimes I wonder if I was ever free, if I could ever make a decision without him behind it, guiding it from the shadows. That's how I live now, with the feeling of being trapped in a net I can never break, with the certainty that, even if the threats will one day cease, the scars left by a betrayal will never completely disappear, and even if the storm passes, the traces of fear will still be there, lurking from the darkness. This story is not just mine. It is that of anyone who has suffered the betrayal of a person they trusted, of anyone who has experienced the fear of being watched, of being at risk without knowing when or how it will happen. The lesson is simple, yet painful. Trust is a gift that can be destroyed in a second, and sometimes the greatest danger lies with those we know, not strangers. Every time the rain lashes the windows, every time the wind whispers through the cracks in the house, I feel like my life is suspended in an endless wait. In the past, the rain used to bring me happy memories, quiet afternoons with the family, moments of calm. Now, however, it's just another reminder that the storm has never stopped hitting me, and as the house creaks in the dark, I keep waiting for the inevitable. Ever since Sophia appeared in my life, everything began to take an uncertain turn. She was not someone who entered my world with the right foot, but at that moment, my existence was empty, immersed in routine and monotony. It was a time when anything seemed better than solitude. Sophia slipped gently into my life, like a warm wind that, at first, seemed to ease my weariness, but would soon turn into a storm. At first, everything was intense, rapturous. Every look, every gesture, every word dragged me more and more into a spiral of desire and despair. Everything seemed perfect, as if I had found a kind of refuge in her. But, as happens in stories that are really worth telling, perfection never lasts. I clearly remember the first hint that something wasn't right. It was a Friday night, the first time I decided to stay home. I had managed to convince her that we weren't going out, that we would spend the night quietly. But when I closed the door behind her, something changed. She started looking at me with those eyes, so deeply empty, as if she was searching for something in my soul that she didn't want to find. At the time, I tried to convince myself that it was just a passing concern, maybe jealousy. I thought it was natural in any relationship. However, I soon realized that what was going on was much deeper, much darker. Sophia began to manipulate every situation so that everything revolved around her. What at first seemed to be an act of affection, a token of love and affection, soon became an invisible chain that bound me tighter and tighter. It no longer allowed me to have time for myself, nor for my friends, nor for my family, much less for my work. My hours of rest, my moments of calm, were replaced by her constant presence. If I was not by her side, I felt the pressure of her demands, the constant demand to show her how much I loved her. At first it seemed like an understandable attitude, a way to reaffirm the bond, but it quickly became suffocating. Soon, everything lost its meaning. My friends began to disappear from my life. Conversations became scarcer. Sophia's calls and texts became increasingly insistent, and when she didn't respond instantly, I could feel the tension in her voice, the fear and anxiety she conveyed, as if my silence was a threat of abandonment. The threats began to be more and more direct. First was a small comment, a phrase that, at first, I didn't take seriously. "If you're not with me, you're not going to be with anyone." I tried to play it down. I thought it was just an exaggeration on his part, a moment of insecurity. But something in her eyes told me it wasn't just that. As time went on, his control over me became more palpable. I was no longer making decisions for myself. My every move, my every step, seemed to be accountable to his will. Somehow, he had managed to isolate me from everyone without me even realizing it. I didn't notice it at first, but one day when I looked around me, I realized that there was no one left, no one who could help me. Days passed and I began to notice a deeper disconnect in the relationship. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't understand. It was as if he was preparing for something, as if there was something I didn't see, a game in which I no longer knew what my role was. The feeling of being trapped in a labyrinth, one that I had not built, but in which I could no longer escape, consumed me little by little. Sophia had become a mystery, an unsettling figure who seemed to always move one step ahead of me. Her hold on me had become a cage, and with each passing day, the claustrophobia of that prison increased. One rainy afternoon, as the sky darkened as if foreshadowing something worse, everything changed. She came home with a strange expression, a kind of revelation that had overtaken her. Thunder rumbled in the sky, as if the world itself was about to shatter into pieces. But what really chilled my blood was the calm in her eyes. She was no longer the same woman I had previously known. Something had changed in her, something much darker and more dangerous. I felt my body instantly tense and, although I didn't know what exactly had changed, I understood that the danger was no longer just a latent threat, but something that was right in front of me. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sophia offered me something to drink. At first, I didn't suspect anything. I was so exhausted, so caught up in the whirlwind of her constant control that I paid no attention to what she was offering. It wasn't until I felt an intense burning in my throat that I knew something wasn't right. It was such a sudden, sharp sensation that panic immediately swept over me. I bolted upright, trying to get to the kitchen, but the world began to fade around me. My legs were unresponsive, my mind clouded. With the last of my remaining strength, I made my way to the phone. But even though I had it in my hands, I couldn't speak. I could only feel my body burning and a cold sweat running through me, while, on the other side of the window, the storm increased in intensity. The emergency call was the last connection I had with reality before I lost consciousness. The paramedics arrived quickly and tried to stabilize me, but there was something in their eyes that told me this kind of situation was not new to them. Poisoning, they said with a professional calm, but with a hint of horror that I couldn't help but notice. The poison Sophia had given me was so subtle, so designed not to be immediately detected, that it was fortunate I had been given time to react before I fell completely. Her face, impassive, seemed to be waiting for everything to take its course, as if she were watching a game in which I no longer had any power. When I woke up in the hospital, I was told that I had been on the verge of death, but that I was out of danger. At that moment, amidst the sedatives and the fog of confusion, I knew that my life had changed forever. Sophia had crossed a line that could not be erased, a boundary that once crossed left scars impossible to heal. The same woman who had tried to take everything from me, who had demanded my love and my time, had tried to destroy me in the most calculated and cold way. After the incident, everything quickly fell apart. The police arrested her, and the testimony she herself gave left me cold. "If not for me, then not for anyone," she said, with a terrifying calmness that still haunts me in my nightmares. Psychological tests revealed what I had already begun to suspect. Her mind had become unhinged. It wasn't just jealousy or a simple desire for control. There was something much deeper, something that cannot be explained in simple words, but can be felt on the skin. Today, as the rain continues to hit my window hard, I feel like I can finally breathe with some peace of mind, but I know that, despite everything, I will never be the same. The anguish, the constant fear, that feeling of being watched even in the most intimate moments, do not dissipate so easily. I had a hard time understanding what really happened between us. I was so caught up in his mind games, I didn't see the reality in time. I now know that danger does not always come in the form of monsters or strange shadows. Sometimes danger comes from those we least expect it, from people who promise us love, but are actually building our own prison. I will never be the same. But perhaps in this unpredictable world, understanding the limits of control, obsession, and what it really means to love, is the only thing that will allow us to survive intact. Because in the end, the only thing left is to learn to look at people with the eyes of truth, without falling for their lies disguised as affection. And never forget that sometimes, the storm that destroys us the most is the one we least expect. My life before all this was normal, or so I thought. I was a watch model, and although I didn't consider myself famous, my face appeared on posters and advertisements all over the country. I spent my days in photo studios, traveling between cities, and in the few quiet moments, I enjoyed my alone time. Like anyone trying to stay in their own world, without much exposure to others beyond work, I felt good. I wasn't looking for big celebrities or attention outside of the camera spotlight. Living in my small apartment, uncluttered and uninterrupted, was what I had always wanted. Then, however, something strange began to happen. Something I could not foresee. Something that changed my life forever. I clearly remember the first package. It arrived one afternoon, as I was returning to my apartment after a long day of shooting. It was no ordinary package, not something I could have expected. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. I left it on the table without giving it much thought. It didn't intrigue me at the time, but that indifference quickly turned into a mistake that would cost me more than I could have imagined. Inside the package was a letter. It was handwritten, in neat, almost perfect penmanship. It did not mention my name, but the words were clear and direct. I watch you from afar, but I am more than just a spectator. Soon we will be together, never to be separated. Something in the tone of those words unsettled me. A strange sensation, a pressure in the air, settled in my chest, but at that moment, I did not understand what was to come. I put the letter aside and went on with my life, although there was already something inside me that had changed. I thought that perhaps this was a somewhat obsessive fan, someone with too much imagination, who would soon tire of it. But it was what happened next that made me begin to doubt my perception of reality. More letters came, more and more personal ones. Sometimes I would find them in my mailbox, sometimes on the windshield of my car, even on the stairs of the building where I lived. Each one contained details that only someone who watched me constantly could know. My schedule, the routes I took to get to work, the little routines I had never shared with anyone. Like an unsettling puzzle, each letter revealed more about me than I knew myself. I remember feeling a mixture of irritation and fear. I decided to ignore them, thinking that this was a fan who had crossed a boundary, but not something I couldn't handle. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, a passing thing, but it wasn't. The letters kept coming, each time with more and more details about my personal life, things that no one, not even those close to me, knew. The feeling of being watched began to grow, like a weight in the air that grew heavier and heavier. I could not escape this invisible pressure, and I felt trapped in a net that I did not know how to break. The moments of peace I once enjoyed began to fade, and in their place, a constant discomfort took hold of me. One night, rain began to fall in torrential downpours. The sound of wet glass on the windshield was almost deafening as I drove back to my apartment after a particularly exhausting day. My mind was so absorbed in the monotonous sound of the rain and the accumulated fatigue that I didn't realize something wasn't right. I didn't immediately notice that there was someone in the back seat of the car. As I turned the key to start the engine, a cold, strange feeling ran down my back. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something didn't belong in that space. It was a presence I hadn't invited. Fear came over me instantly. I thought maybe someone had gotten on by mistake, someone who wanted to ask for my autograph or who recognized me on the street. But what happened next was so unexpected that I could barely react. In an instinctive act, I turned off the engine. The rain was still pounding on the windshield, but all else was silent. Then, a sharp knock on the back of the seat made me jump. My body reacted out of pure adrenaline. I slammed on the brakes and accelerated without thinking. In the blink of an eye, the car skidded on the wet asphalt, losing control and crashing into a tree in the ditch. The last image I had before I lost consciousness was of the window fogged by the rain. A face, expressionless, stared at me from the back seat. The same face I had seen so many times in the letters, but now completely distorted by the fog. And then, everything faded into darkness. I woke up in the hospital. Everything was confusing. Cold lights, monitors beeping, an indescribable feeling of pain spreading throughout my body. I was in a coma for 3 weeks, but what horrified me most was not waking up, but what I saw when I looked in the mirror for the first time. My face was no longer the same. My scars, the burned and deformed skin, the look that now reflected something dark, something I had never known before, terrified me. The accident had changed everything. My appearance, my life, my identity. But the worst thing of all was not just the accident. It was what happened next. The woman who had been in the back seat, that presence that had been watching me, did not survive. She died on impact, as did my illusions that this could all have been just a bad patch, an isolated experience. The dread I felt no longer had any logical explanation. What had begun as something strange had now become a nightmare that had no end. The physical pain I endured during those 3 months of recovery was nothing compared to the darkness that took over my mind. Memories of the letters, that constant feeling of being watched, began to echo in my head like an unstoppable echo. They kept repeating over and over again, and with them, the idea that perhaps everything that had happened had a purpose that I still didn't understand. As if it wasn't just a matter of being the victim of someone else's obsession, but that somehow I myself had been part of it all. The days following the accident were grim, not only because of the constant reconstructive operations, but because of the growing sense that this woman, or what she represented, was still haunting me. The doctors, of course, could not understand how such a fortuitous accident could have happened. Investigations showed that the car had skidded in the rain, but no one could give me an answer as to how that woman had gotten into the back seat. She had disappeared from the records, and no one knew how she had gotten there. Slowly, I began to think that maybe it had all been a coincidence, a series of strange circumstances. But the night I was finally able to walk with some semblance of normalcy, everything changed. The feeling of being watched never went away. I walked the streets with my eyes always straight ahead, but I felt that something or someone was watching me from the shadows. The obsession that once seemed harmless to me was no longer so, not only because of the accident, but because of what came after. My growing paranoia, the feeling of always being one step behind a reality I no longer recognized. It wasn't just the fear of someone else trying to hurt me. It was the fear of myself, of how I had changed. Now, as the rain continues to fall and my face reflects a pain that cannot heal, I wonder if I will ever be able to escape that woman's obsession. Her presence is here, in every corner, in every nook and cranny, deeper than I ever imagined. I've learned something in this process. It's not just someone else's obsession that destroys us. Sometimes it's our own, because when someone becomes obsessed with us, they drag us into an abyss where we cease to be who we were, where our own shadows become as real as those who once tried to destroy us. Fear does not always come from the unknown. Sometimes the real fear is seeing that what we fear is within ourselves, because when everything we know begins to crumble, we discover that sometimes the real monster is the one we can't see, the one that grows inside us when we stop being who we were. My name is Victor, and I don't know how to start this story. In fact, if I'm honest, I'm not even sure if I'll ever finish it. But I feel that somehow I need to share it. Someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to hear the truth, even if it's just a distant echo that dissolves in the storm of memories that still haunts me. Maybe, hopefully, someone will manage to save themselves from what I couldn't avoid. That night, exactly 2 years ago, began like any other. The rain lashed the empty streets with a fury that hadn't let up for weeks. It was the same endless storm that had shaken the city, a constant peal of thunder and drops crashing to the pavement, as if the sky was trying to drag us all into the deepest depths of darkness. There was no sign that anything was about to happen, just the monotonous sound of the rain and the hum of my car's headlights cutting through the fog. Everything seemed normal, but what happened that night I could never have anticipated. I used to stay late at the office, not because I was asked to, but because there was something about that cluttered emptiness that attracted me. That stillness, interrupted only by the sound of the coffee machine or the distant ticking of some forgotten clock. I knew that at that moment no one could interrupt me. No one would call me, no one would harass me. Just me, the white walls, the sound of my footsteps, and the rain pounding relentlessly. It was commonplace for me. But that night was not the same. When I finally left the building, I was tired but clear-headed. I thought about getting home, fixing myself something quick for dinner and resting. Cars were speeding down the avenue, but the city seemed quiet, as usual. The rain was pattering on the car windows as I settled into the seat and started driving south. Street lights flickered from time to time, and the sound of tires on water mixed with the rumble of thunder. At first, everything seemed calm, just another night. However, something changed, something strange, something that I could not identify at the time, but that I have never since managed to forget. It was then that I felt I was not alone. A car appeared behind me, keeping a considerable distance, but enough to make me feel uncomfortable. At first I ignored it, thinking I was simply driving slower than the rest. I sped up a bit, hoping the car would be left behind. But it didn't. It sped up too, and that uncomfortable feeling settled on me, like a heavy weight on my chest. There was nothing particularly remarkable about that car, or its driver, but there was something about its presence, something disturbing. Its persistence. It just kept being there. It accelerated when I accelerated, braked when I braked. I could see the lights reflecting in the mirrors, but I couldn't make out anything else. Not the driver's face, not a sign that would give me any clue as to who was behind the wheel. It was just a constant shadow behind me. By now I had left the bustle of the city behind. The streets seemed empty, as if everyone had taken refuge somewhere safe. The feeling of loneliness was overwhelming, but that shadow would not go away. My breathing became irregular, and my eyes kept glancing at the rearview mirrors, hoping to find some answer that never came. I accelerated, seeking to gain distance, but the car was still close behind. It was always there. It was as if the driver knew exactly what he was doing, as if he could anticipate my every move. If I accelerated, so did he. If I braked, he stopped. He moved as an extension of my actions, and something inside me told me it wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a simple pursuit. Something else was at play. Was he playing with me? What did he want? Suddenly, I made an impulsive decision. I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose him. I made the turn without much thought, hoping the car would turn too, giving up the chase. But it didn't. The sound of its tires was still there, steady, haunting. It was so close I could feel the pressure in the air, as if it were stalking me from the darkness. My skin bristled, and my heart beat so fast, I feared it was going to burst out of my chest. Anguish grew, and the thought of running away settled in my mind. But instead, I made an even riskier decision. I stopped in the middle of the street, turned on my hazard lights, and stood perfectly still. I needed to see what the car was doing. I needed to confront it somehow. Something inside me told me that if I didn't, I would never know who it was or why it was there. The car stopped too, a few feet away. The headlights were still shining, but I couldn't see anything else. The darkness inside the vehicle was total. There was no sign of life, no movement. I couldn't even tell if there was anyone inside. No one got out of the car. The world seemed to have stopped, and all that could be heard was the steady patter of rain and the distant sound of thunder. Minutes passed, maybe more than 5. Tension was building in the air. My breathing was ragged, and the silence became even more deafening. The car, that shadow that had followed my footsteps for so long, did not move. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and the anguish grew with each passing second. Finally, the car began to move. It moved slowly forward, approaching me. My body tensed, and a wave of panic ran through every fiber of my being. But something inside me told me I had to stay there. I couldn't run away. If I did, the game would never end. Somehow I had to face it. I revved the engine, ready to avoid the inevitable. But the car didn't stop. It glided toward me, with a determination I couldn't understand. It was no longer a reflex. It was not a predictable movement. It was something strange, unsettling, as if the driver was determined to catch me. I began to drive aimlessly, my mind clouded with panic. I didn't check my mirrors. I no longer wanted to see the dark figure approaching. I just wanted to escape, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. I couldn't get away from that shadow that stalked me, from that inexplicable presence that haunted me. I took a shortcut, a road I knew well, but when I came to a usual curve, I encountered an obstacle. A truck stopped without any explanation. My brakes screeched in an attempt to stop, but it was useless. I skidded, lost control, and the impact was inevitable. I hit the steering wheel hard and the world faded into darkness. I woke up in the seat of my car. The rain was still coming down hard. The sound of thunder seemed closer than ever, and my breathing was still ragged. Everything was hazy, but a strange feeling was running through me. Something was not right. I looked around, but the car that had chased me was gone. It had disappeared. There was no trace left, no sound of tires, no lights that had shone in my mirrors. Only the storm. I didn't understand what had happened. I don't know if the driver got scared, if he decided to stop following me for some reason, or if something else happened, something I could never understand. All I know is that, after that night, I was never the same. 2 years have passed since that night, but the image of the car still haunts my mind. The chase, the feeling of being watched, stalked, that anguish that never fades. I never knew who he was, or why he followed me. I never had time to understand his motives, if he ever had any. Now, as I write these words, the rain is still falling, and the city is still the same. The wind is still whispering in the distance. I keep driving, but I never feel safe. I have learned something important in those moments of despair. It wasn't the chase that really terrified me. It wasn't the risk of being run over. What really terrified me was the certainty that there is always something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to take the next step. Because in this world, sometimes, the greatest danger is not in what you see, but in what you will never come to understand. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, remember this: terror is not always a scream or an apparition. Always a scream or an apparition. The real terror lies in the mind of the one who follows you, in the stillness of the darkness that stalks your life without you knowing it. It is not the storm that pushes you to the edge of the abyss. It is the certainty that you don't know why you are there. I was never a person who believed in luck or destiny, but today I have no choice but to think that all this has been written somehow, like a script with no return, a closed cycle that only stops when, at the end, one of the actors is no longer there. Maybe that's why I feel so oblivious to what happened, as if I were watching my life from the outside, waiting for it to end and for the rain to wash away the traces. It all started years ago when I met Diana. She was everything a man could want: intelligent, beautiful, determined. There was something in her eyes that, when we met, left me speechless. She was the kind of woman who could captivate with just a look, who could alter the course of your life without barely noticing it. But what I didn't know until much later, what I never imagined, is that her life not only moved at my pace, but that there was another, darker pace, one that escaped into the shadows of her past. Juan was the first man I knew had loved Diana, and he was also the first man who, for some reason I never fully understood, began to follow me. At first it was something subtle, almost imperceptible, like a shadow that one feels without seeing it. I paid no attention to it. I was concentrating on my life, on my projects, on the woman who was beginning to be part of my future. Diana had been my refuge, the reason why I woke up every morning with the illusion of a better day. However, that apparent tranquility soon began to crumble. The first signs of what was to come were not obvious. Sometimes Diana would mention Juan in their conversations, but always in a casual way, like someone who talks about an ex without her voice betraying any deep feelings. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't question her. After all, we all have a past, don't we? But Juan wasn't satisfied with just being part of Diana's past. Soon, he became an unsettling presence in my life. At first, his following seemed harmless. A couple of glances across the street, the odd message or two. But what really alarmed me was what happened one night when the storm swept through the city. It was a particularly rainy night, and I was at home, brooding, deep in my own demons. The sound of the rain pounding on the windows was almost deafening, as if the storm wanted to destroy everything. In that chaos, I saw a figure. I didn't understand who it was at first. I only made out a shadow on the door, someone standing outside, looking at me through the glass. I didn't pay too much attention to him until his gaze was fixed on me. It was Juan. His eyes, cold as steel, penetrated me with an intensity that froze me completely. His presence was not only physical, but imbued with a palpable menace. I didn't see him again until weeks later, when his presence became more constant, more aggressive. Juan was no longer just the shadow in the window. Now he was a constant in my nights, a whisper behind closed doors, a name repeated in the murmurs of the city. No one knew what was going on in my head, and no one cared. People thought it was paranoia, a mind game I had created for myself. But no, it wasn't paranoia. It wasn't paranoia. My life with Diana became more tense, more dangerous. The quiet moments disappeared, and what was once love had now become a war of silences. Diana, who had been my refuge, was now a bond that united us both, but in a perverse way. She apparently didn't see the problem, or maybe she didn't want to see it. She was caught between two worlds, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, something was holding her back, something she could not free herself from. But I could. I could see reality. And when it all exploded, it wasn't a surprise. It was a release. It was on that rainy night that everything changed. The storm began to fall harder than ever. The city shut down, the lights flickered, and the sound of water crashing against the windows covered everything else. I was at home, alone, thinking about what was to come. I knew Juan wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and he wanted it all. Juan had lost his mind after the divorce. Everyone knew it, but no one dared to stop him. No one understood. No one saw what I saw. That the man Diana had been with, the man who had shared her life, was now nothing more than a specter of revenge. A specter with cold eyes and bloody hands. The obsession had consumed him completely. Years of suffering had warped his mind, and all that remained of him was his desire to destroy me. That night, I prepared myself for the worst. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I could no longer live in fear. I could no longer be the target of his madness. Juan not only wanted to destroy me, he wanted to erase me from the map, from Diana's memory, and no one had told him that I was not an easy man to eliminate. I armed myself. I made sure that every move was calculated, that every step was part of a trap that, at some point, would catch him. The place was dark, away from the city, far from the lights that could give me away. The sound of rain covered everything, and the storm turned the ground into a sticky mud, making any attempt to escape even more difficult. If it was going to be the end, I wanted it to be on my terms. He arrived without a sound. At first, I only heard the rustle of tree branches swaying in the wind. I knew he was near. I could feel him. Those kinds of presences that you can't see, but you know. Each time the rain came down harder, his figure blurred in my mind, but his shadow was the same. The weight was endless. The drops of water fell on my face, cold as knives. The hours passed and the silence of the night seemed to take over everything. But I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I was aware that any mistake in my actions could have definite consequences. And then, I saw it. He was a shadow among the shadows, moving with a determination that only a man who has lost everything can have. I was not surprised to see him. I knew it would come sooner or later. What I didn't know was that that night would be different, that I was no longer the man I had been before. There were no words. There was no shouting. Just two men facing each other, one with the intent to kill, the other with the intent to survive. What happened next is only a blurred memory in my mind. one blow after another, a sound of bodies colliding, of desperation and fear. Juan's hands, full of fury, hit me with the rage of a man who had been stripped of everything, but I also felt a strength I did not know. Fear no longer paralyzed me. There was something in me that had awakened, a silent fury that pushed me to fight for my life. When it was all over, the rain stopped, as if the sky decided it was no longer necessary. The air cleared, and the darkness ceased to be thick, at least for that night. I saw him lying there motionless, and I knew I no longer had to fear him. I no longer had to live on constant alert. I no longer had to be his victim. Now Juan was behind bars, serving his sentence, while I could breathe freely. The peace I had dreamed of finally came, but not without sacrifice. What gave me pause was not only the revenge I had so longed for, but the constant question that never ceased to haunt my head. Who is the real monster in this story? People change, but pain, rage, and despair seem to have an eternal way of manifesting itself. Maybe Juan wasn't the only one to blame. Maybe I was, for not seeing the storm coming, for not stopping the madness before it became hopeless. Maybe we are all responsible, in some way, for the suffering of others. The rain came again, but this time it didn't scare me. It was just rain, and with it, an unsettling calm. My name is Orlando. For years now, nights have haunted me, not only because of the darkness, but because of the constant sound of the rain hitting the windows. 4 years. 4 fucking years that have brought me to the edge of sanity, to the limit of my existence, and all because of the insistence of a man I can't get rid of. Every step I take, every corner I walk, I feel his gaze, his presence, always lurking. But I'm no longer afraid. No more. Today, at last, I'm going to face him. The rain falls with unusual violence tonight. The drops hammer with such force against the ground that the sound becomes a constant pressure on my chest. My footsteps dip into the puddles, creating distorted ripples that slowly dissipate, like my thoughts. It's the first time in a long time that I've left the house without constantly looking over my shoulder. But today, I can't afford to be weak. Today, I must face the inevitable. For years I have noticed something strange in my life, as if I am trapped in a routine in which I am only a supporting actor. I remember the first encounter, the first time I noticed something strange, a presence in my periphery, a furtive glimpse through a window, a shadow moving just outside my field of vision. But I never imagined that something so subtle would become an obsession. The obsession of a man who couldn't stop following me, watching me, making me feel small, vulnerable. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just a coincidence, but time proved otherwise. More and more, his gestures became clearer, more evident. The feeling of being watched wouldn't let me sleep, and when I did, the dreams became nightmarish. The house, the work, the places I visited every day became the scenes of an endless hunt. It did not let me breathe. My life began to break down, although I did not accept it. I thought I could run away, change jobs, move, change my phone number, delete my presence on social networks. But nothing was enough. He would always find a way to show up, to make me feel his presence. It was as if he was chasing me in a game I couldn't escape from. He followed me, watched me, studied me. The worst thing was the silence, the stillness of the rain against the window, the creaking footsteps of someone approaching, the deep and almost inaudible breathing, as if the night itself had become his accomplice. The fear came not from physical contact, but from the certainty that somewhere, just out of my reach, someone was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to catch me. Sometimes I thought it wasn't real, that everything I felt was just paranoia. But as I looked at the small details, the footprints in the wet dirt outside my house, the scars left on the car door, I understood that I wasn't going crazy. There was someone out there, and he had no intention of stopping. One evening, after days without sleep, I decided I could no longer live with this uncertainty. I couldn't anymore. If there was one thing I feared, it was becoming a shadow, like him, someone who no longer existed in reality, someone who was completely irrelevant. I was not going to be that kind of person. I had to face my fear, and to do that, I had to face it. I couldn't afford to be a victim anymore, not of him. It was a stormy night when I finally saw him across the square. His tall, shadowy figure was silhouetted against the dim streetlights. The rain was still falling furiously, and people were taking shelter in nearby stores and cafes, as if they were afraid of the storm. But I was not afraid of the storm. No, the danger was in front of me, in the form of that man who silently watched me from a distance. There was no turning back. Fear turned to rage, and rage to action. I walked towards him without hesitation, with a determination I never thought I would have. Every step echoed on the wet pavement, the sound of my boots mixed with the rumble of thunder. He didn't move, didn't approach or give any sign that he planned to flee. He looked at me with an unsettling calm, as if he already knew what I was going to do. The rain lashed my face and the wind blew hard, raising small curtains of water that blurred my vision. As I got closer, I felt a shiver down my back. His presence was suffocating, as if the air had become thicker. And for a moment, I wondered if I really wanted to continue. But it was too late to regret it. The instant I decided to step forward, I had come full circle. What happened next I can't accurately describe. It was a kind of macabre dance, a fight without words, without rules. The sound of the impact of my fists on his skin, the crunching of bones, the rumbling of my own heart in my ears, all blended into a chaos of sensations that now blurred, as if they were only fragments of a nightmare. Finally, when the man's body lay on the ground, motionless, with the rain wiping the blood from his face, I felt that the storm had passed, but not in the way I thought. It was not a release. The silence, the emptiness left after the storm, was even more terrifying than the sound of thunder, because I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. No matter how hard you fight, terror doesn't go away just because you decide to face it. Terror lives inside you, and the moment you think you have conquered it, it possesses you even more. People began to slowly emerge from their shelters as the rain subsided. There were no witnesses. No one saw what happened. Perhaps I realized too late that I could no longer ignore the fact that, somewhere in the back of my mind, I had already begun to become what I feared most. One of them. A predator, with the same dark shadow that had haunted me for so long. I walked away from the place, and as I walked under the first lighter raindrops, I felt something watching me again. This time it was not him, but a part of me that had never ceased to exist. And I understood that in this world, sometimes there are no victims or villains, just people trying to survive in any way possible, even if it means becoming what they swore to destroy. The rains calmed down, but the weight of the night was still felt on my skin, on my soul. In the end, I understood that it was not fear that had moved me to act, but the need to set a precedent, to prove to myself that I was not weak, that I could control it. But in that attempt, I realized that, like the storm, fear always returns. It never goes away completely. And I, even though I have faced it, am still under its influence. The first lights of day began to illuminate the empty streets, and the sound of water falling from the rooftops became softer, almost imperceptible. I walked aimlessly, without a clear destination. My mind was scattered, caught between tiredness and guilt, searching for something to anchor me to reality. But the storm had done its work, and although the sky was beginning to clear, I could not shake off what had been left behind. There was something inside me that had changed forever, something I couldn't erase, no matter how much I wanted to. Like the rain that washes away everything in its path, fear had penetrated me so deeply that it was impossible to distinguish it from my own essence. I could no longer separate the shadow that haunted me from the one I had begun to carry myself. And even if the world moved on, even if life went on with its indifferent course, I knew that something in me had been marked, sealed by that stormy night. Sometimes the real enemy is not outside of us, but within. And there are moments when there is no turning back. The rain hits the window furiously, creating a curtain of water that slides to the ground, as if the whole world were drenched in despair. Outside, thunder rumbles deep in the earth, as if the sky itself is roaring its wrath. I am here, alone, trapped in this third-rate apartment, in some forgotten corner of a city I should never have visited. The storm seems to be the only thing that accompanies the sound of my heavy, choppy breathing, as if my body has lost the ability to understand what is happening. I know there is no escape. The door is locked, the windows sealed, yet I dare not stand still. I can't. Something is outside, lurking, and I don't know if that threat is in the city or in my own mind. In my stomach there is a knot that won't dissolve, a feeling of being watched. But when I look out the window, all I see is the endless torrent of water soaking the streets, making the city collapse silently under its weight. I started running hours ago, but I don't know where I'm going. I only know that I can't stay here. Something is chasing me. A man, maybe more, maybe a shadow, but I haven't seen him clearly, and that only increases the sense of danger. There is something dark about his presence, something that makes me feel like the city itself is conspiring against me. If I try to leave, I'll probably run into him. And if I stay, I don't know if I'll ever be able to breathe easy again. I long ago gave up any hope of finding help. In this city, people seem to disappear in the rain, as if disintegrating into thin air. No one stops to ask, no one cares. Indifference covers everything. That terrifies me more than anything else, that this place has somehow made me part of its web. The buildings, the streets, even the air seem to absorb me, blurring my identity until there is nothing left of me, as if I myself were just another shadow, about to fade into nothingness. I think of my family, of my friends, of those I left behind without knowing that something so strange was brewing, something so dark. The thought that I will never be able to see them again, that this could be the end of me, slowly consumes me. But still, I dare not give up. There is something inside me, a tiny spark of hope, that compels me to continue. Maybe it's despair, maybe it's foolishness, but I won't let the rain quench my will to fight. I close my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my mind. The sound of the storm is deafening, but in the midst of it all, I hear a distinct sound, sharper than the rest of the noise, the creak of a door opening, followed by footsteps slowly approaching. My heart races. The damn noise can't be real. I imagine it, for sure. It's the storm playing with my mind. But what if it isn't? I get up from my chair and walk over to the window, sticking my face to the fogged glass. My reflection, distorted by the water, is all I see. I try not to think about what might be waiting for me outside, but anxiety consumes me. I can't sit still, not now. The place is too quiet, too empty. I feel like I'm an insect caught in an invisible net, waiting for the final blow that never comes, but which I know is near. The front door opens wide, and the sound of footsteps intensifies. Someone is walking down the hallway, calculatedly, meticulously. It's the kind of sound that sticks in your chest and makes you realize that you are not alone, that there is something watching you from the shadows. My mind screams at me that I shouldn't look, that I should stay silent and wait, but the urge to see what's going on overpowers me. I move quickly toward the door. I breathe slowly, trying to contain the fear that consumes me, the cold sweat that runs down my forehead. I don't have much time. If he's outside in this hallway, I don't know if I'll see him coming. I don't know if I can escape. The apartment door is closed, but the doorknob begins to turn slowly. There is no noise, just the sound of the metal yielding to the movement of the key. A low, almost imperceptible creak. as if the air itself is bending to that action, each movement, each passing second, more unsettling than the last. My body tenses, my mind searches for a way out, but there is none. When the door opens fully, all is silent. The footsteps cease. The wind howls outside the window, but the calm that comes after each storm is even more disturbing than the bustle of the rain. The sense that something is watching, lurking, becomes more real. Through the dark threshold of the door, I feel the emptiness spread throughout my being, as if the air itself is weighing on me. I think of running, of hiding, but I don't know where. Time seems to stop. A second that stretches until it becomes an eternity, but I can't just wait. A primitive instinct forces me to move, to act. And so I do. I leave the apartment, sneak down the corridor without making a sound. The humidity chills my bones, but what chills me is not the temperature, but the sensation of being chased. The footsteps, though distant, echo in my head. There is no turning back. I'm caught in a net I can't see, but I know it's there. And I feel, deep inside me, that my movements are being watched. The city, with its endless rain, looks like a labyrinth. Every corner turns into a dead end. Every building becomes a steel trap, impenetrable. There are no familiar faces. No one looks at the passerby. No one asks. No one helps. And I am no exception. My name is just a word in the distance. David. But in the end, who remembers him? Who remembers a man lost in a city that forgets all its inhabitants? Every turn in the street, every crossroads, seems to take me further away from any chance of rescue. The rain has ceased to be just water falling from the sky to become a web of despair that envelops everything. It is a blanket of oblivion that creeps through the streets, absorbing the last vestiges of humanity. Man, if he really exists, is no longer in sight. But I feel him closer than ever. The shadows seem to move at their own pace, playing with my mind, confusing me. But it doesn't matter. My only option is to keep going. Keep going until I can't anymore. I can't stop. Once, long ago, I thought the worst enemy was what you couldn't see. But now I know that the real danger is in what you know is there, lurking, watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. The city doesn't forget me, and the rain won't stop until I pay for something I don't even fully understand. I keep walking. My breath is no longer my own. Every step sounds like it's my last. I don't know if I'll escape. I don't know if I'll ever find myself safe. But as long as the water keeps falling, I know this is my only struggle, to survive. In the end, it is not fate that consumes us. It is the certainty that every action, every decision we make, brings us closer to the truth we don't want to see. The rain does not stop, and the city, in its indifference, continues its course. But we, trapped in our own choices, keep running, not knowing if we will ever reach the shore. Perhaps the greatest terror is to understand that there is not always a safe place, nor an end that allows us to rest. Flight is the only option, the only constant, and as we move forward, we realize that, perhaps, there never was any escape. The storm will continue to fall, and the city, faceless, will continue to watch. What awaits us in the darkness? Is the rain a mere reflection of what is to come? The answer is hidden in the very echo of the footsteps echoing in the night. Nothing is what it seems. The rain never stopped falling that night. It pounded on the windows with such uncontrolled fury that I couldn't tell if it was thunder or just the sound of water hitting glass. The wind, furious, dragged the water along the sidewalks, and the trees struggled to stand firm, bending to the ground as if they wanted to surrender to the chaos that was unleashed in the sky. Outside, everything seemed on the verge of collapse, as if the storm was not only devastating the landscape, but also the very soul of the world. I was alone, and my house seemed to be the only structure resisting the weight of the storm. Sitting on the couch, with the lights off and the curtains closed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. My mind, that damned machine that never stops, kept turning over the memories, the smell of the humidity coming through the cracks in the windows, the incessant sound of the wind, the pressure I felt on my chest. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew there was no escape. There was something in the air that night, something thick, something heavy. I wasn't always someone easy to scare. My work in the city had led me to face complicated situations, to deal with people and circumstances that required absolute control of emotions. I always managed to stay calm. I could always think fast. Nothing really scared me. Nothing made me uncomfortable. But then, everything changed. When you find yourself on the edge of the abyss, when the pieces of your life fall one after another like a juggler trying to salvage something that will never be possible, you begin to question what you once thought you understood. The first time I saw it, I didn't recognize it. Or maybe I did, but I refused to believe it. I was so focused on my own problems, the demands of my job and my own mistakes, that I didn't realize what was happening. Something began to appear in the shadows, something creeping silently, something watching me. It was then that I remembered what had happened years before, and I understood that somehow it could not have been a coincidence. That rainy afternoon, just before the storm began, I received a letter. The letter had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. I didn't recognize it at first, but the contents, I did. It took me a few seconds before I realized that it could not be a coincidence. There were details of my life that only a few people knew. Details of my past that I had buried deep. Things I never wanted to come to light. And there they were, laid out on paper like a silent threat, a shadow in the corner of my mind. The message wasn't direct. It didn't say, "I will hurt you," or "I know what you did." It was much more subtle than that. There were no words of threat, just a sense of discomfort, an invisible pressure on my chest. I knew someone had discovered something I should never have known. And worse, I knew that person had the power to destroy me. That same day, as the sound of the wind whipped loudly through the house, I felt the first shiver. At first, I told myself I was paranoid. The storm, the fear, the lights flickering. But something inside me, something visceral, told me that I shouldn't trust that feeling, that I shouldn't ignore the fear that enveloped me. There was something much bigger lurking in the darkness, something I couldn't see, but that I knew was there, waiting for me. The phone rang at 3 a.m, the piercing sound of its ring piercing the stillness of the house. The number that appeared on the screen was unknown. I knew I shouldn't answer, but something compelled me to do so. There was no voice on the other end, only heavy breathing, and then the sound of a door slamming shut with a clatter. From that moment on, paranoia took hold of me. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The strange noises, the flashing lights. I could no longer be quiet anywhere. I could no longer concentrate. I had begun to see myself stalked by an invisible enemy, but its presence was so palpable that I felt as if I could touch it, as if the air I breathed was permeated with its threat. I could not escape that feeling. Somehow, everything felt like a trap. Every step I took, every movement, was part of a larger plan. Something stalking me, watching me relentlessly. The hours passed and the rain did not stop. I was home, alone, trapped in my own mind, surrounded by the storm, but also by a much more dangerous presence. I could feel it creeping through the walls, infiltrating the stillness of the night. There were times when I thought I heard something out of place, something that didn't make sense, but I couldn't place it, couldn't shape it. I knew someone had been watching my every move. The next few days were a spiral of paranoia and despair. Every time I left the house, I felt that someone was following me, that my steps were not my own, that someone else was controlling my destiny. Every place I went, every corner, every street became a threat. I was no longer able to tell if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if someone was really after me. However, as time went on, it became clearer and clearer to me that this was not just a game. There was something much more macabre, something much darker behind it all. One afternoon, after several days without being able to sleep or eat, I received another letter. This time, the handwriting was darker, firmer, as if the sender was getting closer and closer. There was no need for more words, because all it contained was a picture of me, taken without me realizing it. I was standing in the doorway of my office, staring blankly, unaware that someone was watching me from across the street. The image was so sharp that I could recognize every detail. It had been taken minutes before I closed the door behind me. The phone rang again that night. I answered, but this time there was no breath. Just a cold, deep voice whispering a single word to me. "I'm looking at you." Panic immediately overcame me, but before I could do anything, the call was cut off. The feeling of being trapped, of being under the constant gaze of something I didn't understand, consumed me completely. Now here I am, watching the rain fall from the window, listening to the storm that never seems to end. In the house, every sound unsettles me. The noises of the storm mix with the creaking of the wood in the house. Something is wrong. I know, because the danger is not in the storm, nor in the echoes of thunder. The danger is inside me, lurking, waiting for me to make the fatal mistake. Something dark, something that has been waiting to come to light. Something that someone else knows and that threatens to destroy me. The storm surrounds me, but I know the worst is inside my own house, inside me. And worst of all, I don't know if I can escape it. The man who threatens me knows a secret so dark from my past that he could destroy me completely if he wanted to. But he doesn't. Not yet. Why? Why doesn't he end it? Why doesn't he do what he has to do? It's strange, but there's something about the storm that makes me think that maybe he never wants to. Maybe he's waiting for me to do it, to fall under my own weight, to be dragged down into the darkness he already knows so well. And as the rain pounds tirelessly on the windows, I feel that everything I do, every decision I make, brings me closer to that darkness. A darkness that I don't know if I want to avoid, but that I can't help but fear. The rain was hitting the glass with such fury that I couldn't tell if it was raining or if the sky itself was trying to crumble. The drops fell erratically, forming long lines that blended with the darkness of the night, enveloping everything in a heavy, almost dense atmosphere. The sound, an incessant rumbling, filled the air, overshadowing all other noises. That was all I could hear. The storm. I was alone, all alone. A deep silence settled in the house, a silence that was more terrifying than any other noise. My breathing was the only thing that broke the emptiness, and although the sound of the rain seemed to envelop everything, I felt watched. Somehow, something was moving in the darkness, but I couldn't pinpoint what. There was something in the air that night, something different. Perhaps it was the fact that the streets, normally noisy, were now empty, with the lights on the poles reflecting faintly on the puddles. Or maybe it was the feeling that time had stopped, that the outside world had disappeared, and I, trapped in this lonely-looking house, was the only being still breathing. The shadows seemed to lengthen until they devoured everything, as if the storm had invaded even the very essence of the house. In my mind, the images of the day intertwined with the confusion of the night. Something had happened, but I couldn't clearly remember what. Or I did know, but I preferred not to think about it. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to know that, while I was here, someone was watching me. The man hadn't said much when he found me. He didn't need to. His presence was more than enough to understand everything. His gaze, lost between anger and madness, was the only thing that mattered. The dilated eyes, the pupils reflecting something I didn't want to understand, and the latent threat emanating from his body like a nauseating perfume. A man like him needed no words to make his purpose clear. He knew he was capable of anything. From the window, he watched as the storm showed no signs of abating. He was trapped, caught between the darkness of the night and the shadows of my own thoughts. There was no sign of life on the streets, no vehicle peering out, no one approaching. I was completely isolated, more alone than ever. The house, which had been my refuge on other occasions, now looked like a dungeon. The walls, still intact, felt like a prison. In the house, the heat was suffocating. The air was stale, as if the very atmosphere was holding everything bad, everything wrong. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me. I could feel my heart pounding, my pulse racing, my nerves clenching every fiber of my being. I felt watched, but there were no clear signs that anyone was nearby. I couldn't tell if he was inside or outside, if he had already entered, or if he was waiting for me to make the slightest mistake. Every corner, every shadow, seemed suspicious to me. In every silence, I imagined his footsteps echoing, close, very close. The worst thing was that I didn't know where to start. Everything I had done so far had been a desperate attempt to stay in control, but control was already slipping away. Every second that passed, the further I moved further away from rationality, the closer I moved into the uncertainty of despair. My breathing was getting heavier, more erratic, and no matter how hard I tried to calm myself, something inside me was telling me that the worst moment was coming. I had made the wrong decisions before. I thought I could trust certain people, that I could feel safe, that the world wasn't as full of monsters as the books or the movies said. But that night, everything changed. I had met too many faceless monsters, too many beings hiding under human skin. Sometimes you can't see them coming. Sometimes you think they are far away, that you are protected by distance, that a little luck will be enough to survive. But the truth is that you never know when you're going to cross paths with something you can't control. The man was real, and he was close. I knew he wasn't the kind of person who is easily intimidated, who doesn't settle for mere threats. His look told me he wanted nothing less than the worst. He wasn't afraid of the consequences, and I, standing there, helpless, felt like a cornered animal, waiting for the next move to be the last. How had I gotten here? When was the exact moment when everything changed? I hadn't moved from the spot. My eyes roamed every corner of the house, searching for some sign that I could escape, that I could do something to protect myself. But the storm covered everything. The deafening sound of the rain disoriented me, overrode my senses. The windows, clogged with droplets that slid uncontrollably, reflected my face, distorted by the inner turmoil. It seemed as if the place was crumbling around me, although in reality everything remained intact. It was the mind that was crumbling. The anguish was growing with each instant, like an invisible shadow that was taking over my being. As the hours passed, the fear did not dissipate, but only intensified. The idea that he could be just a few steps away, waiting for me to make a single mistake, tortured me. The danger was there, palpable, within reach, and yet it was so intangible that I struggled to give it form. My mind was a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts, and at times I didn't know if I was dreaming, or if I had already crossed a line from which I could not return. The uncertainty was choking me. Time seemed to dilute, to melt away like water running down glass, impossible to catch. Time seemed to have stopped, or perhaps it was me who could no longer perceive it correctly. The sound of the storm, once a distant echo, was now all I could hear. And in between those echoes, an unsettling feeling came to me, the certainty that the man was closer, but I could see nothing. The shadows were lengthening and the dark corners were becoming more and more menacing. I could feel him, as if his presence hung in the air, an invisible burden crushing me. In the end, it didn't matter how long I waited. It didn't matter how many times I looked toward the door or tried to listen for footsteps, because everything I had built up in my mind as protection crumbled when the door burst open. The storm, as if nature herself had orchestrated it, collapsed in a single roar. I, standing still, dared not move. One step, just one step, would have been enough to end it all. The house, the shelter, was no more. The man was there. The man's presence was there. I could feel it, as real as the air I breathed, so close that I could no longer distinguish if he was behind me, or if there had simply ceased to be any kind of distance between us. I knew then, at that exact moment, the real threat was not him. It wasn't even the storm. The real threat was in the human mind. The man had been only a vehicle, an instrument of a greater harm, the reflection of a deeper truth that I did not want to accept. Because what had happened to me was not an accident. It was a reminder of how fragile we are, how close we are always to being dragged into the abyss. Sometimes, the real monster is not in the shadows, but within ourselves, waiting for the right opportunity to come out. Everything that had happened, every second of anguish, every mistake made, had been the product of our own decisions, our own weaknesses. The man, though terrifying, was but a manifestation of that which is always lurking, our fears, our shadows, our doubts. And that night, that storm, that empty house, taught me something I could never forget. There is no such thing as true refuge. We are all, at some point, at the mercy of someone, or something. There are no walls strong enough, no doors secure enough. It's just up to us what we do with that. And though the storm finally subsided, fear continued to lurk in every corner, in every breath, because real storms aren't always water or wind. Sometimes it is the internal storms that drag us into the abyss. The rain kept pounding furiously on the window, as if it wanted to break it. The sound was a frantic beating that added to the constant noise of my thoughts. The darkness enveloped me, not just because it was night, but because something had changed in the air, something that set my nerves on edge. If I had had a safe place to go, I would have. But there was no such thing left for me. The phone vibrated on the table, interrupting my litany. It was the third message in less than an hour, and like the other times, it had no content beyond a number. A code that marked one more step toward the inevitable. There was something in that message that made my skin crawl. Something that made me finally understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. The man who seeks me is not a simple enemy, nor a wandering vigilante. No, the man who is looking for me is a professional. And worst of all, he is not just one man. He is backed by a network of shadows, a criminal organization so vast that I have not managed to fully understand it, but enough to know that his arm is long and merciless. I was in the wrong city, at the wrong time, and my gut told me there wasn't much time left. It wasn't the first time I found myself on the run anymore. It wasn't. But the circumstances were different this time. I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey. And as the rain pounded hard against the window, I felt the weight of my paranoia crushing me. Something inside me told me that the clock had already started ticking. The world had become an unfamiliar place, and every shadow that crossed my field of vision felt like a threat, as if I could no longer trust anything or anyone. I remember how it all began. It was a simple business deal that I undertook to execute, something trivial, with no major implications. But things took a turn, a very dark turn. The contact I had had, someone I trusted, provided me with information I should not have received, information that I should never have known, and that, of course, no one asked me to know. The worst thing was that upon discovering it, it became impossible for me to ignore it. It was as if someone had given me the key to open a door I shouldn't even be looking at. But the door was already open, and from there, everything began to fall apart. Every step forward seemed to only drag me further into the chaos. The rain pounded incessantly, as if the sky understood my anguish. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate. I needed to think. The most urgent thing was to keep moving. I couldn't stand still. not even for a second. The streets were no longer safe, nor the parks, nor the sidewalks, nor the quieter corners of the neighborhood. I was marked, and as the water continued to fall relentlessly, the threat of being hit felt closer and closer, as if someone was there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to act. It was not a policeman or some kind of government agent. No. What was behind me was something far more dangerous. The organization that was after me does not play by the rules of the state. They don't follow protocols or moral principles. Their only rule is survival. And if that meant eliminating a traitor or someone who just happened to cross their path, they did it without thinking. He had gone too far, and now there was no turning back. I could feel his presence, invisible but palpable, like a shadow following me at every step, watching me relentlessly. Of course, I tried to erase everything related to the failed business. I traced a series of movements that led me to disappear, at least in appearance. But still, I couldn't help but see how the shadow of the organization was catching up with me, no matter how much I moved. Signs began to appear. A car following me closely, a familiar face that at first tried to hide in the crowds, and the indescribable sensation of being watched, always watched. Paranoia was taking hold of me, and although I tried to rationalize my fears, something inside me told me that I was not crazy. I was being hunted. It was inevitable. Then the call came. It was an ordinary afternoon, or so I thought. The deceptive calm of the city enveloped me when the phone rang for the second time. I answered without thinking. The message was clear, and although there were no words, his message came to me with surgical precision. You know, we are awaiting your arrival. In that instant, I experienced the feeling that everything I had accomplished up to that point had been in vain. I knew that the clock could not be stopped, nor could it be accelerated. All that remained was to wait for the inevitable. Time became a nightmare, an endless countdown. The only question I had left was, where? Where would they find me first? No matter how hard I tried to move, I could no longer trust anyone. Those who had once been my friends, those who knew my life, were no more than strangers. I had lost them all, as if the fire of truth had consumed any ties. Now, I was the only one left, facing this endless storm, looking for a corner where I could take shelter while the shadow of death stalked me. Somehow, I managed to take refuge in an isolated apartment, in a neighborhood so gloomy that even the rain seemed to sink into the gloom. I found the feeling of isolation more unsettling than anything else. I was trapped, but I couldn't stay still. I went out, walked aimlessly, but always with the constant feeling that someone was nearby. The traces of the organization were invisible, but I felt watched, constantly watched, as if the air itself was full of eyes following me. Fear gripped me, and doubt settled in every corner of my mind. Every car that passed near me filled me with terror. Every shadow crossing the street in the dark became a threat, and the sound of the rain, once a mere murmur, became a deafening backdrop that only amplified the growing anguish in my chest. It was then that I saw his face, or rather, I saw what had ceased to be a human face. It was the figure of a man with an empty, implacable gaze, and a smile as cold as the rain itself. No warning was needed. He no longer needed a phone, or a call, or a coded message. The message was clear. He was here, in front of me. And all I could do now was run. I ran through the flooded streets, my footsteps echoing on the sodden sidewalks. The rain was still falling, harder than ever, like an endless curtain separating me from the world. Every corner, every intersection, seemed like a trap, an obstacle that only brought me closer to my final destination. But I did not give up. I couldn't. Not yet. Fear pushed me to keep running, as if I could somehow cheat fate, as if I could find a place to hide, a corner where they could no longer catch up with me. Finally, when I no longer knew if I was running to save myself or to escape my own fears, the darkness swallowed everything. and the last thing I felt before falling was the pressure in my chest, the certainty that the man who was chasing me would never stop looking for me. I knew what awaited me, because he had been looking for me for too long. The screaming, the pounding, the discomfort of falling. Nothing could stop him. Nothing could save me. It was already too late. The worst of it all, however, is not that it hit me. The worst thing is that, as I was falling, I understood that my life no longer mattered. The organization had already won. It was not a matter of life or death. It was not a matter of escape. It was inevitable. I was trapped in a game I could not win. And as the rain continued to fall on my body, I remembered one thing I never fully understood until that moment. You cannot escape from what you have done yourself. The man who is looking for me works for a criminal organization and will not hesitate to eliminate me if I get in his way. And I, in my ignorance, thought I could escape it. But the truth is, in the end, none of us can escape the reality we have created. And that's what we never understand. Running away is not an option. All we can do is wait, in the rain, until the time runs out. The rain was pounding hard on the window of the old cabin where I had taken shelter. The sound of water falling from the roof echoed in my ears like a kind of constant murmur, a distant echo that kept me alert, almost restless. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows cast through the glass, shaped by the storm lights erratically illuminating the sky. Each flash seemed like a warning, a reminder that something was about to happen, something he could not control. I was all alone, or so I thought. My thoughts scattered with each clap of thunder that shook the cabin walls. The storm had begun without warning, lashing out with unusual fury, as if nature itself was enraged by something. But it was not the storm that unsettled me, but the absolute silence of the house around me. The wind howled through the cracks, and the sound of water crashing against the roof became a roar that seemed to have no end. In the distance, the trees rustled like specters in the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange noises I had heard earlier, those that I couldn't tell if they came from outside or if I had simply imagined them, like the sound of something moving along the ground, creeping stealthily. A shiver ran down my back, and for a moment, I felt that the cabin itself was watching me. I had been in the same cabin for days. I had sought refuge there to escape something much worse. I had made mistakes, things I could not undo, and now I was paying the consequences. The storm, at first, seemed like a blessing, a break, a respite from the life I had left behind, from the shadows that haunted me relentlessly. But as the hours passed, something began to take hold of me, the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a place that, however distant and isolated, offered me no solace. It was impossible not to think about it, about the man, of the face that had ceased to appear in my dreams, but was still engraved in my memory like a scar. The guilt I felt would not leave me, even though I tried to distract myself with the storm, with the endless days in that cabin far away from everything. The rage, however, was still present. That hatred that had been sown by a man I did not forget, and that, inevitably, sooner or later, always returns. The distance, the days, and the storms were not enough to keep me away from that figure that, like a persistent shadow, had crept into my life in an irreversible way. I don't know how many days I had been locked up in that place. At first, I thought the storm would give me the respite I needed so badly. I wanted to be alone, away from everything. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to take hold of me. I couldn't stop staring out the windows, as if something was watching me, lurking in the darkness. My own thoughts were getting darker and darker, more and more disturbing. I was sure that someone, or something, was there, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And though I tried to convince myself that it was only fear that made me see things that didn't exist, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The memories of that man came back again and again, incessant and heartbreaking. It was impossible to get them out of my mind. It had been a mistake I could not escape. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how far I had walked away from it all, he was still waiting for the right moment to make me pay. His face, his voice, the days we spent together. All those memories had become an unbearable weight, a ballast I couldn't let go of. It all started years ago. The man who now stalked me had been someone close to me, someone I once considered a friend. As friends, we shared moments, laughter, and secrets. But as with many people in life, there was a breaking point. Something I didn't know how to handle, something I didn't foresee. I don't know at what exact moment our friendship turned into enmity, but by the time I realized it, it was too late. Too late to rectify, to stop what was already in motion. It was a simple matter, at least for me. A misunderstanding that turned into something much bigger. He, who had always been a calculating, ambitious man, found in my weakness an opportunity. He had betrayed me, manipulated my decisions, and in the end, had used everything against me to leave me without resources. My lack of insight, my naivety, made me fall into his game. And though I tried to apologize, to make amends, he never forgave. Forgiveness was not part of his dictionary. I was just a piece on his board, and when I no longer served him, he decided that my existence should be destroyed. Now I understand that perhaps forgiveness was never in his plans. To him, I was simply a tool he had used and discarded. Once he had used me for his own benefit, there was no more room for me in his world. It was that betrayal that cost me everything I had ever known. My home, my peace, my very tranquility. And yet, the worst was yet to come. I walked away. I sought refuge in out-of-the-way places, in nameless cities, in empty houses. But it was not enough. The man was still lurking, and my conscience would not let me sleep peacefully. Like a persistent shadow, he was always nearby, waiting, watching, like a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to make his final move. And worst of all, I knew I could not escape. Neither isolation, nor time, nor distance could save me. That night, the phone rang. A call with no number, no name. Just a low, rough voice whispering my name. The sound, soft at first, became an unbearable echo in my mind. My hands shook as I hung up, knowing I could no longer escape. The sound of the storm outside seemed louder, as if everyone was purposely quieting down to listen to my own heartbeat. Fear, like a dark tide, engulfed me. Could it be him? Could he be nearby? The silence in the cabin was deafening. I felt trapped, as if the walls themselves were shrinking around me. My eyes kept moving, roaming every corner of the room, looking for signs, looking for something to tell me that everything was okay, that I wasn't being watched. But there were no signs. Only the pressure of the air, dense and oppressive, and the feeling that my past was catching up with me. Suddenly a noise on the upper floor, a creaking, a slight scraping, as if something or someone was carefully shifting. My heart raced, my skin crawled. I walked steadily, but my breathing grew heavier with each step. I couldn't dismiss the feeling that something was following me, as if my past was catching up with me. The same man, the same monster in the dark. I climbed to the upper floor. The air was thick, cold, damp. The storm outside the cabin continued its fury, but now it was as if the storm inside me was even stronger. My mind was torn between fear and rage, between the desire to survive and the desire to face what I had done. Every step toward the door of the small bedroom was a reminder of what I had caused. Would he be there waiting for the moment to confront me? As I opened the door, I saw something I had never expected. A figure in the corner of the room. His back was turned, motionless, staring out the broken window, as if he was waiting for something, as if he had been there for hours. In that instant, I knew that the storm was not only outside the cabin, it was inside me, and I was sharing it with him. The same storm that had been chasing me all that time had reached its climax. The inevitable encounter was here. As I reached in front of him, the figure turned. I saw him fully for the first time. His face, scarred by time and anger, was a mask of determination. He didn't say a word to me. He didn't have to. I knew he wasn't there for any reason other than revenge. And when he looked into my eyes, I finally understood that everything he had done in the past had been a prelude to this encounter. The storm outside was roaring louder than ever, but it no longer mattered. At last, he had arrived, and I had reached my end. The storm had started much earlier than I remembered, and in the end, it wasn't the rain that drowned me, but my own guilt. Sometimes, the greatest enemy we face is not on the outside, but within ourselves. We can run away, hide our mistakes, think that with time the damage will be forgotten. But the reality is that the shadows of our actions always follow us, patiently waiting for the moment when we have no more escape. When the past meets the present, we are confronted with who we really are. And in that confrontation, there is no room for lies.